The quiet hum you hear in the background, the subtle whirring, that's the sound of a trolley hurtling down a track. But it's not just any trolley. It's a runaway, out-of-control vehicle heading towards a fork in the path, and by extension, towards one of the most enduring and unsettling thought experiments in contemporary philosophy. We're talking, of course, about the trolley problem. Today, we're not just going to encounter this infamous moral dilemma. We're going to trace its very genesis to understand how it came to be and why it has captivated, confounded, and perhaps even exasperated ethicists, psychologists, and even casual thinkers for over half a century. We'll delve into the intellectual landscape that birthed it, meet the brilliant minds who first articulated it, and unpack the fundamental distinctions they sought to illuminate, distinctions that continue to challenge our deepest moral intuitions. To truly appreciate the trolley problem, we need to rewind to a specific moment in philosophical history, post-World War II ethics. The mid-20th century saw a significant shift in philosophy. The linguistic turns and meta-ethical inquiries of earlier decades, which often focused on the meaning of moral language, began to give way to a renewed interest in normative ethics. Philosophers were asking, what should we do? What principles ought to guide our actions, especially in the face of profound moral challenges? The horrors of the war had underscored the desperate need for robust, applicable ethical frameworks, moving beyond abstract theoretical debates to concrete guidance. It was in this intellectual crucible that the stage was set for the kind of incisive, scenario-driven ethical reasoning that the trolley problem epitomizes. Our story truly begins in 1967 with a British philosopher named Philippa Foot. Her groundbreaking paper, titled The Problem of Abortion and the Doctrine of the Double Effect, wasn't primarily about runaway trolleys at all. Instead, Foot was grappling with an ancient and complex moral principle known as the doctrine of double effect, or DDE. This doctrine, deeply rooted in Catholic moral theology, attempts to distinguish between harmful outcomes that are intended as a means to an end, and those that are merely foreseen as an unfortunate side effect of an otherwise morally permissible action. Imagine, for a moment, a military commander who bombs an enemy armaments factory. The intended effect is to destroy weapons manufacturing. The foreseen but unintended effect is that innocent civilians living near the factory are killed. According to the doctrine of double effect, if certain conditions are met, the good effect outweighs the bad effect is not intended, there's no way to achieve the good effect without the bad, etc. This action might be considered morally permissible, even though it results in death. This is often contrasted with, say, deliberately bombing a civilian target to lower enemy morale. There, the civilian deaths are intended as a means to an end. Foot introduced her now famous runaway trolley scenario, not as the central focus of her paper, but as an analogy, a vivid thought experiment to test the nuances of the DDE and similar moral distinctions. Her original formulation, as presented, was something like this. A runaway trolley is hurtling down a track. Ahead on the main track are 5 workmen who will certainly be killed if the trolley continues on its course. You are standing next to a lever. If you pull the lever, you can divert the trolley onto a side track. Unfortunately, there is one workman on that side track, and he will be killed if you divert the trolley. The core question then is stark. Do you pull the lever? Do you sacrifice one to save 5? For many, the intuition here is surprisingly strong. Yes, you should pull the lever. 5 lives outweigh 1. It feels like a regrettable but necessary choice. Foot herself wasn't necessarily arguing for a specific answer, but rather using this scenario, and others like it, to explore the underlying moral distinctions. She juxtaposed this trolley scenario with another, perhaps more disturbing, thought experiment that helped clarify her point. She imagined a doctor who has 5 patients, each needing a different organ to survive. If the doctor could, by some nefarious means, find a healthy individual and harvest their organs, saving the 5, would that be permissible? Most people would recoil at the idea. Foot's brilliance was in highlighting that while both scenarios involve a choice leading to one death to save 5 lives, they feel different. In the trolley case, you are redirecting an existing threat. You are not creating a new threat. You are simply altering its path. In the organ harvesting case, the doctor is actively initiating harm against an otherwise healthy individual, using that individual as a mere resource, a means to an end. This distinction between redirecting an existing threat and initiating a new harm was crucial to Foot's initial analysis. Now, fast forward less than a decade to 1976. Another formidable philosopher, Judith Jarvis Thomson, enters the scene with her profoundly influential paper, Killing, Letting Die, and the Trolley Problem. Thomson picked up Foot's runaway trolley, dusted it off, and meticulously began to dismantle and reassemble it, twisting and turning it to reveal even more complex moral knots. Thomson's primary aim was to challenge and scrutinize the deeply entrenched intuitive difference many people feel between killing and letting die, and to explore the limits of various moral principles people subconsciously hold. Thomson amplified the dilemma by introducing new, more visceral variants. Her most famous addition, and the one that truly cemented the trolley problem's infamous status, is what we now call the fat man scenario. Imagine again the runaway trolley heading for those same 5 workmen, but this time there is no side track. You are standing on a bridge above the tracks next to a very large man. He is so large that if he were to fall onto the tracks below, his body would be heavy enough to stop the trolley. He would die, of course, but the 5 workmen would be saved. The question again, do you push the fat man off the bridge? Here, the numerical outcome is identical to the lever scenario. 1 person dies, 5 are saved, yet for most people the moral intuition shifts dramatically. Pushing the fat man feels profoundly, terrifyingly wrong in a way that pulling the lever often does not. Why, this is the core riddle that Thomson sought to unravel, and it's where the true philosophical power of the trolley problem begins to emerge. Let's break down why these 2 scenarios, though numerically identical, elicit such vastly different moral intuitions. Firstly, there's the distinction between active harming versus redirecting an existing threat. In the classic lever scenario, you are not creating a new harm, you are simply changing the trajectory of an already existing deadly force. You are diverting, not initiating. In the fat man scenario, however, you are directly, physically acting upon an innocent bystander, inflicting a new harm upon him, rather than merely redirecting the trolley's momentum. You become the direct agent of his death in a very personal way. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, there's the concept of using a person as a means to an end. This is a deeply resonant principle, famously articulated by Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that we should always treat humanity, whether in ourselves or in others, as an end in itself and never merely as a means. To treat someone as a mere means is to instrumentalize them, to reduce them to an object whose value is purely in what they can do for others. In the lever scenario, the 1 person on the side track is an unfortunate casualty of the redirection. Their death is a foreseen side effect. They are not being used to stop the trolley. Their presence on the track simply makes that track a dangerous option. In contrast, the fat man is explicitly used as a means. His body is literally the instrument, the human shield that stops the trolley. His personhood is overridden for the sake of the 5. This distinction strikes a profound chord, often explaining much of the intuitive revulsion. This leads directly to the concept of agent causality or moral agency. What is the nature of your involvement in bringing about the death? In the lever case, your action is somewhat removed. You manipulate a mechanism and the trolley does the rest. In the fat man case, it's a direct, physical act against another human being. The visceral nature of pushing someone, feeling their weight, the directness of the causation, seems to activate different moral circuits within us. It feels like your hand is causing the death, rather than simply influencing a chain of events. Thomson didn't stop there. She introduced yet another crucial variant, further probing these distinctions. The loop variant, imagine the trolley again heading for 5. You can divert it to a side track, but this time the side track loops back onto the main track further down the line. There's 1 person on the loop track. If you divert the trolley, it will hit and kill that 1 person. However, their body, now on the main track, will stop the trolley, thereby saving the 5. The loop variant is fascinating because it blurs the lines. In this case, the 1 person on the loop track is both an unfortunate casualty of the redirection, as in the classic lever case, and they are explicitly used as a means. Their body stops the trolley, as in the fat man case. So if your intuition was to pull the lever in the classic scenario, but not to push the fat man, what do you do in the loop variant? It challenges the very clarity of the using a person as a means principle, forcing us to consider what exactly constitutes such usage and its moral weight. These initial formulations by Foot and Thomson immediately highlighted several key philosophical concepts, turning them into a powerful crucible for ethical inquiry. Firstly, the core distinction of killing versus letting die. Is there a morally significant difference between actively taking a life, killing, and allowing a life to end when one could have intervened, letting die? This distinction is paramount in areas like medical ethics, euthanasia debates, and resource allocation. Thomson's work in particular rigorously tests whether our intuitions consistently support this distinction or if it's more complicated than it appears. If we pull the lever, are we killing the 1 or letting the 5 die? If we do nothing, are we letting the 5 die or refraining from killing the 1? The language itself becomes fraught. Secondly, the relationship between intention versus foresight. This harks back to Foot's initial engagement with the doctrine of double effect. When you pull the lever, do you intend the death of the one, or merely foresee it as an unavoidable side effect of saving the five? Most would say you don't intend it, but when you push the fat man, it's much harder to argue that his death isn't, in some sense, intended as the direct means by which the five are saved. This difference in mental state intention versus mere foresight is critical in legal and moral judgments of culpability. Thirdly, the difference between direct versus indirect harm. Pushing the fat man is a direct act of harm. Pulling a lever that redirects a threat feels more indirect, but how indirect does harm have to be before our moral responsibility diminishes? These problems force us to think about the causal chains of our actions and their consequences. These scenarios didn't just pose questions, they immediately sparked intense philosophical debates that continue to this day. One of the primary debates revolves around the reliability of moral intuition versus systematic ethical reasoning. The trolley problem is often described as an intuition pump, a term coined by philosopher Daniel Dennett. It's designed to provoke strong gut reactions. But are these gut reactions reliable guides to moral truth? Or are they merely emotional responses, biases, or echoes of cultural conditioning that need to be critically examined and potentially overridden by more systematic ethical frameworks? This brings us to the fundamental conflict the trolley problem lays bare, the tension between consequentialism and deontology. Consequentialism, in its purest form, argues that the morality of an action is determined solely by its outcomes or consequences. The best action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. From a purely consequentialist perspective, saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 is always the correct choice, regardless of how that outcome is achieved. So a consequentialist might argue you should pull the lever and push the fat man, as both yield the same net positive outcome, plus 4 lives. The intuitive repugnance felt for pushing the fat man is dismissed as an emotional bias irrelevant to the ethical calculation. Deontology, on the other hand, argues that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of their consequences. Moral duties and rules, e.g., do not kill an innocent person, do not use people as mere means, take precedence. A deontologist might argue that pushing the fat man is intrinsically wrong, because it violates the duty not to directly harm an innocent person, or the duty not to treat a person as a mere means. This perspective struggles with the lever scenario, however. If killing an innocent is always wrong, then pulling the lever and causing the death of the one might also be impermissible, even if it leads to 5 deaths. This would lead to a seemingly counterintuitive outcome, allowing 5 people to die when you could have saved them by causing 1 death. The trolley problem forces these 2 giants of ethical theory into a head-on collision, revealing their strengths and their profound weaknesses, and demonstrating that neither provides a fully satisfying answer to every moral dilemma. In this context, we can briefly introduce Robert Nozick, another prominent philosopher. While not directly a trolleyologist, his work on individual rights and side constraints offers a powerful deontological counterpoint. Nozick argued that individuals have inviolable rights, and these rights act as side constraints on what others can do to them. You cannot violate these rights, even if doing so would lead to a greater overall good. Pushing the fat man, from Nozick's perspective, would be a clear violation of his fundamental right to life, an action that cannot be justified by any consequentialist calculus. Beyond these foundational debates, several immediate counterarguments and critiques emerged regarding the trolley problem itself. One prominent critique is that the problem is too artificial and unrealistic to offer genuine insights into real-world morality. Critics argue that such clean, binary choices with perfectly quantifiable outcomes rarely, if ever, occur in the messy reality of human life. Real moral dilemmas are fraught with uncertainty, incomplete information, emotional distress, and complex relationships. The trolley problem, some suggest, is a philosophical parlor game, an intellectual exercise divorced from the complexities of human experience. Another related counterargument focuses on the idea that the scenarios are poorly specified, leading to ambiguity. What if the 5 workers are elderly and close to retirement, while the one is a brilliant young scientist on the verge of curing cancer? What if the fat man is a notorious criminal? What if you, the decision-maker, are a relative of one of the people on the track? What is the certainty of the outcomes? The original problem intentionally strips away these details to isolate the core moral calculus. But critics argue that these details are precisely what give moral dilemmas their weight and complexity, and by omitting them, the thought experiment becomes an impoverished guide to real ethics. A third powerful critique points to the idea that moral intuitions are culturally variable and thus unreliable as a basis for universal ethics. What if people from different cultural backgrounds, with different moral upbringing or religious beliefs, respond differently to these scenarios? If our intuitions are products of our specific sociocultural context, how can they form the basis for universal, objective moral principles? This raises concerns about moral relativism and the search for common ethical ground. Recent cross-cultural studies have indeed shown some variations, though core distinctions like the fat man versus lever often remain robust across many populations. Finally, there are direct critiques of the killing versus letting die distinction itself. Some philosophers argue that this distinction, while intuitively powerful, is often morally irrelevant. If you can prevent a death at little or no cost to yourself, and you fail to do so, are you not as morally culpable as if you had directly caused it? If the outcome is the same, a person dies when they could have been saved, does the specific causal mechanism truly matter? This challenge forces us to consider the moral weight of an action, and whether an omission can be as morally significant as a commission. The enduring power of the trolley problem lies precisely in its ability to expose these tensions and ambiguities. It's not about finding a single right answer that applies to every variant. Instead, it serves as a powerful diagnostic tool, an intuition pump that reveals the intricate, often contradictory, principles that underpin our moral judgments. The thought experiment has permeated beyond philosophy departments, too, influencing fields as diverse as psychology, cognitive science, and even artificial intelligence. Think about self-driving cars. What ethical algorithm should guide a car that has to choose between two unavoidable crashes, one that harms its passenger and one that harms pedestrians? These are real-world trolley problems, now being coded into machines. Similarly, in medical ethics, dilemmas around resource allocation, end-of-life decisions, and organ donation often echo the structural challenges of the trolley problem. Consider a doctor who can save 5 patients by harvesting organs from one healthy patient who happens to be in a coma, with no hope of recovery, but is technically still alive. This is the direct descendant of Thomson's fat man, now given a medical context. Our intuitive revulsion to such a scenario in a hospital setting is very similar to our revulsion to pushing the fat man off the bridge, and for similar reasons. It involves using a person as a mere means, an instrument, rather than respecting their inherent worth. The initial reception of Foot and Thomson's papers was, to say the least, galvanizing. They didn't just pose a problem. They created an entire subfield of ethics. The intellectual ferment they generated led to countless variations, known colloquially as trolleyology. Philosophers began to systematically explore every conceivable permutation, adding new elements, characters, and constraints, each designed to isolate a different moral principle or to test the robustness of an existing one. It was a golden age of thought experiments, revealing the deep, complex architecture of human moral reasoning. The trolley problem also subtly highlights the concept of moral luck. Sometimes our moral choices are dictated by circumstances entirely beyond our control. The person who happens to be standing by the lever or on the bridge is faced with an impossible choice, a situation they did not create. Their luck, or rather their misfortune, places them in a position where any action or inaction has dire moral consequences. This reminds us that our moral lives are not always about clear-cut, self-determined choices, but often about navigating tragic circumstances that we are simply unfortunate enough to encounter. So, from Philippa Foot's initial exploration of the doctrine of double effect, through Judith Jarvis Thomson's masterful expansion and the introduction of the fat man, the trolley problem has evolved from a simple analogy into a vast, intricate network of moral dilemmas. It challenges us to articulate why we believe what we do, to move beyond gut feelings and identify the underlying principles, consequentialist or deontological, that guide our ethical compass. It reveals that morality is rarely a straightforward calculation, but a complex interplay of intuition, reason, and deeply held values, often leading to profoundly uncomfortable and irresolvable tensions. As we continue our journey into the philosophy of the trolley problem, remember these foundational distinctions and debates. They are the bedrock upon which all further variations and discussions are built, forming the essential framework for understanding why this seemingly simple thought experiment has become such a powerful, enduring, and endlessly debated tool for exploring the very nature of right and wrong. Welcome back to Snooze Philosophy, where we unravel the tangled threads of moral dilemmas, not to put you to sleep, but perhaps to gently guide you through some of the most profound questions humanity has ever grappled with. Today, we're placing one of the most powerful and intuitive ethical frameworks, utilitarianism, squarely on the tracks of the trolley problem. Prepare for a journey where consequences reign supreme, and the greatest good for the greatest number becomes the guiding star, even when that star leads us to some deeply uncomfortable places. At its core, utilitarianism is an ethical theory that posits the best action is the one that maximizes utility, which is usually defined as maximizing happiness and well-being and minimizing suffering for the greatest number of people. It's a philosophy focused entirely on consequences. The morality of an action isn't inherent in the act itself, but rather in its outcome. If an action leads to a net increase in good, it is morally right. If it leads to a net increase in harm, it is morally wrong. This framework immediately presents itself as a compelling candidate for resolving the trolley problem. Imagine you're standing by that lever, confronted with the agonizing choice. 5 lives versus 1. From a purely utilitarian perspective, the path seems remarkably clear, almost dispassionately so. Let's delve deeper into the core tenets that shape this view. First, there's consequentialism. This is the bedrock. For a utilitarian, the only thing that matters in determining the rightness or wrongness of an action is its results. Forget intentions, forget duties, forget inherent moral rules. What will happen if you pull the lever? What will happen if you don't? This single-minded focus on outcomes makes utilitarianism incredibly powerful in situations demanding a clear-cut choice, especially when lives are at stake. Second, we have the principle of welfarism, often interpreted as hedonism in its classical forms. What exactly constitutes good? For early utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham, it was straightforward: pleasure and the absence of pain. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, he famously declared. The good is that which brings about the most pleasure and the least pain for all sentient beings. This isn't about selfish pleasure, but the aggregate sum of pleasure across everyone affected. And finally, the crucial tenet of impartiality. Every individual's happiness and suffering count equally. There is no special weight given to your family, your friends, or even yourself when calculating the greatest good. The suffering of a stranger on the tracks is just as morally significant as the suffering of someone you know. This is where the greatest good for the greatest number truly comes into play. It demands an objective, almost mathematical approach to morality, where personal biases are stripped away. These principles were first systematically articulated by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Bentham, a radical social reformer, sought to create a rational, scientific basis for morality and law. He envisioned a hedonistic calculus, a way to measure the intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent of pleasure and pain that actions would produce. His aim wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was to reform prisons, abolish slavery, advocate for women's suffrage, and even argue for animal rights, all on the grounds that these changes would maximize overall happiness and minimize suffering in society. His vision was revolutionary, often shocking to his contemporaries who were rooted in traditional religious or deontological moral frameworks. The idea that morality could be reduced to a calculation of pleasure and pain, that pushpin is as good as poetry if it produced equal pleasure, was both liberating and scandalous. His most famous student, John Stuart Mill, a generation later, would refine and humanize utilitarianism, addressing some of its most glaring perceived flaws. Mill, himself experiencing a profound personal crisis where he questioned the adequacy of purely quantitative hedonism, introduced the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. He argued that intellectual, aesthetic, and moral pleasures were intrinsically more valuable than purely sensual ones. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, he famously wrote in Utilitarianism. This was an attempt to make the theory less swinish and more aligned with human dignity and flourishing. Mill also tackled the problem of individual rights, which we'll address more thoroughly in our counterarguments, by arguing that protecting individual liberty and rights ultimately leads to greater overall utility in the long run. He saw liberty as essential for human development and the pursuit of higher pleasures. Later, Henry Sidgwick, in his monumental The Methods of Ethics, 1874, provided the most systematic and comprehensive defense of utilitarianism, meticulously exploring its relationship with common-sense morality and attempting to show how intuitive moral principles could often be justified on utilitarian grounds. His work emphasized the principle of rational benevolence, solidifying the impartial and universal scope of utilitarian concern. And in our modern era, philosophers like Peter Singer have revitalized utilitarianism, applying it to contemporary global challenges such as poverty, animal welfare, and effective altruism. Singer's work rigorously demonstrates how a consistent utilitarian framework demands significant sacrifices from the affluent to alleviate suffering elsewhere, pushing the boundaries of moral obligation. Now let's apply these principles to the trolley problem itself. In the classic lever scenario, where the choice is to pull a lever diverting a runaway trolley from a track with 5 people to a track with 1 person, a utilitarian would unhesitatingly advocate for pulling the lever. The calculation is stark: 5 lives saved, 1 life lost. If you do nothing, 5 lives are lost. If you act, 1 life is lost. The net outcome of pulling the lever is a gain of 4 lives, 5 saved minus 1 lost, compared to a loss of 5 lives if you do nothing. From an impartial, consequentialist viewpoint, the action that saves the greater number of lives is the morally imperative one. The one person's life, while equally valuable, simply cannot outweigh the collective value of the 5. The intuitive discomfort arises, of course, with the fat man variant. Here, the only way to stop the trolley from killing 5 people is to push a large man off a bridge into its path, sacrificing him to save the others. Many people who would readily pull the lever in the first scenario recoil from pushing the man. Yet, from a strict utilitarian standpoint, the moral calculus remains precisely the same. The outcome is identical. 5 lives saved at the cost of 1. The method of saving those lives, whether by pulling a lever or by physical intervention, is irrelevant to the utilitarian calculus of consequences. The principle of impartiality dictates that the life of the fat man is no more or less valuable than the life of any of the 5, nor is it more or less valuable than the life of the single person on the alternate track in the lever scenario. Therefore, the utilitarian would logically, though perhaps emotionally agonizingly, advocate for pushing the man. It is the maximization of overall well-being, the greatest good for the greatest number, that must prevail. This consistent application of principles highlights several key strengths of the utilitarian approach. 1. Logical consistency. Once you accept the premises that consequences are paramount and that all lives count equally, the conclusions, however difficult, follow with undeniable logic. There's a clear decision procedure. 2. Focus on objective outcomes. Utilitarianism aims to move beyond subjective moral feelings and traditions, seeking to base morality on something tangible and measurable. The actual impact on well-being. It asks what actually happens, not just what feels right. This makes it appealing in contexts requiring rational, evidence-based decision-making. 3. Potential for promoting social welfare. Historically, utilitarian thinking has driven immense social progress. From public health initiatives to infrastructure projects, policies are often justified on utilitarian grounds. They aim to improve the lives of the majority, even if they might impose minor burdens on a few. It provides a framework for thinking about society's overall good. To understand utilitarianism's nuances, it's important to distinguish between its 2 main forms, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is what we've primarily been discussing so far. It dictates that in any given situation, you should choose the action that will produce the greatest good. Each act is assessed individually. So, in the trolley problem, an act utilitarian would look at the specific circumstances and conclude that the act of pulling the lever or pushing the man leads to the best outcome in that particular instance. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, asks a slightly different question. What rules, if generally followed, would lead to the greatest good? Instead of evaluating individual acts, it evaluates general rules of conduct. A rule utilitarian might argue that while pushing the fat man in this specific instance saves 5 lives, a general rule permitting the pushing of innocent people off bridges would have devastating long-term consequences. Such a rule would erode trust, generate fear, and ultimately lead to a less happy and secure society. Therefore, even if a single act of pushing the man is beneficial, it might violate a more general rule, e.g., do not intentionally kill innocent people, that, when consistently applied, maximizes overall utility. However, even with this distinction, when confronted with the extreme, isolated nature of the trolley problem, rule utilitarians often arrive at a similar conclusion to act utilitarians. They might argue that a rule against killing innocents generally produces the greatest good, but that in highly unusual, life-or-death scenarios where breaking the rule saves a vastly greater number of lives, making an exception itself could be argued to serve the greater utility of society by acknowledging the profound value of life itself. The logic often bends back towards saving the most lives, even if through a slightly more circuitous route. For the trolley problem, the numerical superiority of saving 5 over 1 typically holds true across both forms, making it the dominant utilitarian answer. Yet this unwavering logic is precisely why utilitarianism often clashes with our deepest moral intuitions, particularly in the fat man scenario. That gut-wrenching resistance to pushing someone to their death, even to save others, isn't easily dismissed. This intuitive discomfort serves as a crucial springboard for the robust counterarguments against utilitarianism. Let's explore these critiques, which often highlight the inherent tensions within the philosophy itself. 1. Violates individual rights. This is perhaps the most significant and often cited critique. The fat man scenario starkly reveals utilitarianism's potential to treat individuals as mere means to an end, as expendable units in a larger calculation. The man on the bridge has a right to life, a right that a utilitarian calculation seemingly rides roughshod over. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant, with his deontological ethics, would argue that people possess inherent dignity and should always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means. Pushing the fat man directly uses him as a tool, a human shield, to save others, violating his fundamental moral status. Utilitarianism, critics argue, lacks a robust concept of individual rights that cannot be overridden by collective good. It raises the specter of the scapegoat problem. If sacrificing one innocent person could prevent mass hysteria or save many lives, a utilitarian might be compelled to endorse it, even if it feels profoundly unjust. 2. Tyranny of the majority. This concern extends from the individual rights critique to broader societal implications. If the greatest good for the greatest number is the sole moral imperative, what protects minority groups or unpopular individuals when their interests conflict with the overwhelming desires of the majority? Imagine a society where the vast majority derive immense pleasure from discriminating against a small minority. A purely unconstrained utilitarian logic could, theoretically, justify such oppression if the net happiness of the majority outweighed the suffering of the minority. This is where John Stuart Mill's contribution becomes vital. He, as a utilitarian, fiercely defended individual liberty and on-liberty, arguing that protecting individual rights, even unpopular ones, actually maximizes overall long-term utility. Free speech, the ability to dissent, and the protection of individual flourishing, Mill believed, are essential for societal progress and the discovery of truth, leading to a richer, more vibrant, and ultimately happier society. His defense of liberty, therefore, was not a departure from utilitarianism, but a sophisticated utilitarian argument for rights. Nevertheless, the inherent tension remains within the framework for those who believe rights are fundamental, not merely instrumentally valuable. 3. The problem of measurement. How do we accurately quantify happiness, suffering, and overall well-being? Bentham's hedonistic calculus, while groundbreaking, proved incredibly difficult to apply in practice. How do you compare the intensity of one person's pleasure with another's? Is saving a life objectively worth more than preventing severe pain or curing depression? Mill tried to address this with his distinction between higher and lower pleasures, but this introduced qualitative judgments that seem to move away from a purely objective calculation. Furthermore, can we truly foresee all the consequences of our actions? The ripple effects of a decision can be vast and unpredictable, making a precise utilitarian calculation nearly impossible in real-world scenarios. This practical difficulty raises questions about the applicability and reliability of utilitarianism as a decision-making framework. 4. Moral demandingness. Utilitarianism, consistently applied, can be seen as extraordinarily demanding. If our constant moral duty is to maximize overall good, it would imply that we should always be working, donating, or acting in ways that produce the most beneficial outcomes, even at significant personal cost. Why spend money on a new gadget when that money could save lives in a developing country? Why pursue a personal hobby when you could be volunteering? This perspective suggests that nearly every action, unless it's the most optimal one for the greater good, might be morally wrong. This can lead to what critics call moral saints, individuals who sacrifice their entire lives for others, leaving no room for personal projects, relationships, or even simple pleasures, which seems to contradict a common-sense understanding of a flourishing human life. Virtue ethics, for example, would counter by focusing on the development of good character and practical wisdom, acknowledging the importance of personal well-being and relationships as integral to a well-lived life, rather than demanding constant, impersonal sacrifice. 5. Slippery slope. This argument suggests that accepting a utilitarian solution in extreme cases, like pushing the fat man, could open the door to increasingly problematic justifications. If we allow for the sacrifice of one innocent to save 5, where does the line get drawn? Could it desensitize us to the value of individual life? could it lead to a normalization of such actions, making it easier to justify sacrificing minorities for the greater good in less extreme circumstances? This isn't a direct philosophical critique of utilitarian logic, but a practical and psychological concern about the long-term societal effects of embracing certain moral precedents. Despite these powerful counterarguments, utilitarianism has undeniably been a force for good in many historical and contemporary contexts. Consider some compelling historical anecdotes and examples where utilitarian thinking has played a crucial role. 1. The social reform movements. As mentioned, Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism provided a rational, secular basis for a wave of progressive social reforms in the 19th century. His ideas influenced movements for prison reform, advocating for more humane conditions and rehabilitation rather than purely punitive measures. Utilitarians were at the forefront of the abolitionist movement, arguing that the immense suffering of enslaved people far outweighed any economic benefit derived from slavery. They also championed women's rights and universal suffrage, believing that extending political participation would lead to greater overall happiness and better governance. These movements demonstrate the immense power of utilitarianism to challenge existing injustices by focusing on the aggregate well-being of all. 2. Mill's personal crisis and refinements. John Stuart Mill's own life provides a fascinating anecdote. After an intense intellectual upbringing under his father, a strict follower of Bentham, Mill experienced a severe mental breakdown in his early 20s. He realized that a life solely dedicated to maximizing pleasure through rational calculation was insufficient for human happiness. This crisis led him to appreciate the importance of poetry, art, and emotional depth, prompting his refinements to utilitarianism with the introduction of higher and lower pleasures. His struggle highlighted the need for a more nuanced understanding of human well-being than Bentham's purely quantitative approach, showing how the theory could evolve to address its own internal critiques and human experience. 3. Philosophical reactions to Bentham's radicalism. Bentham's uncompromising pursuit of a scientific morality often provoked strong reactions. Critics like Thomas Carlyle, who coined the term the dismal science for economics, viewed utilitarianism as a cold, calculating, and ultimately dehumanizing philosophy. He lamented its focus on material well-being over spiritual or aesthetic values. Even Bentham's eccentricities, such as having his body preserved and displayed as an auto icon, served to underscore his radical commitment to his philosophical principles, including the utilitarian idea that even after death, he could still provide some utility as an educational and conversational piece. Looking at real-world applications and examples today, we can see utilitarian principles at work. 1. Medical triage during disasters or pandemics. This is perhaps the most direct real-world analog to the trolley problem. During crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, decisions had to be made about scarce resources, such as ventilators. Medical ethics often dictates that resources should be allocated to maximize the number of lives saved, or to maximize life years gained, even if it means denying treatment to those with a lower chance of survival. This is a starkly utilitarian approach, prioritizing the collective outcome over individual claims in a time of extreme scarcity. Similarly, battlefield triage requires agonizing choices to save the most combatants possible. 2. Public health policies. Many public health initiatives operate on utilitarian principles. Vaccination mandates, for instance, prioritize herd immunity and the overall health of the population over an individual's right to choose not to vaccinate. Laws requiring seatbelts, banning smoking in public places, or regulating environmental pollutants are all implemented because they are believed to contribute to the greatest good for the greatest number by reducing harm and improving collective well-being, even if they impinge on individual liberties. 3. The lifeboat scenario. This classic ethics thought experiment directly mirrors the trolley problem. A group of survivors are in a lifeboat designed for fewer people. Resources are scarce and the boat is sinking. To save anyone, some must be sacrificed. Who gets thrown overboard? Who gets the last ration of food and water? These are agonizing choices where a utilitarian framework would dictate saving the maximum number of people, however brutal the decision. 4. Cost-benefit analyses in public policy. Governments and organizations routinely conduct cost-benefit analyses for large-scale projects, which are implicitly utilitarian. When deciding whether to build a new highway, a dam, or a factory, policymakers weigh the economic benefits, increased convenience, and job creation against the costs of environmental damage, displacement of residents, or health risks. The aim is to choose the project that yields the greatest net benefit for society. This is utilitarianism at work in the realm of governance, even if not explicitly labeled as such. In essence, utilitarianism provides a clear, consistent, and often powerful framework for navigating the trolley problem. Its emphasis on consequences, the greatest good, and impartiality leads to a straightforward, albeit often counterintuitive, answer. Sacrifice the one to save the five, regardless of the method. Yet this very clarity brings it into direct conflict with deeply held moral intuitions and other ethical frameworks, particularly deontology, which champions individual rights and duties, and virtue ethics, which focuses on character and human flourishing. The tension generated by utilitarianism in the trolley problem isn't a weakness of the dilemma, but a testament to the profound complexities of human morality. It forces us to confront whether we are truly comfortable with a purely outcome-driven ethical system, or if there are certain lines, certain individual rights that should never be crossed, regardless of the potential for greater good. This clash of intuitions and principles is what makes the trolley problem such an enduring and illuminating thought experiment, inviting us to delve deeper into the very nature of right and wrong. Join us next time on Snooze Philosophy as we turn our attention to deontology, an ethical system that offers a starkly different perspective, focusing on duties, rules, and the inherent rightness or wrongness of actions themselves, regardless of their consequences. Prepare for a world where certain actions are simply forbidden, no matter how many lives might be saved. We've spent some time grappling with the fascinating, yet often uncomfortable, world of consequentialism, a realm where the moral compass is fixed firmly on the outcome, the greatest good for the greatest number. But what if we told you there's an entirely different way to think about right and wrong? A path that often leads to very different conclusions, particularly when faced with something like the trolley problem. Today we turn our gaze to the formidable and often counterintuitive landscape of deontological ethics. If consequentialism asks, what will be the result of my actions? Deontology asks, what is my duty? What are the rules I must follow regardless of the outcome? Here, morality isn't about consequences at all, but about adherence to certain duties, rules, and fundamental rights. It posits that some actions are inherently right or wrong, full stop. They possess an intrinsic moral value, or lack thereof, independent of what they might achieve. The very word deontology comes from the Greek deon, meaning duty, and logos, meaning study of or science of. So literally, it's the study of duty. And at the very heart of this system, towering above all others, stands a figure of immense intellectual power and influence. Immanuel Kant, writing in the Enlightenment era amidst a fervent belief in reason and individual autonomy, sought to establish a moral philosophy grounded not in divine command, not in fickle human desires or emotions, and certainly not in the unpredictable results of actions, but in pure reason itself. For Kant, to act morally was to act rationally. He argued that truly moral actions stem from a good will, a will that acts purely out of a sense of duty, out of respect for the moral law. This good will, he famously asserted, is the only thing good without qualification, because its goodness doesn't depend on its success or its consequences. A good intention, even if it fails to achieve its aim, retains its moral worth. To understand Kant, we must grasp his distinction between two types of imperatives, hypothetical and categorical. A hypothetical imperative is conditional. If you want X, then you must do Y, for instance. If you want to pass this exam, then you must study. The must here is contingent on your desire to pass. It's a pragmatic rule, not a moral one. A categorical imperative, on the other hand, is unconditional. It commands us absolutely, universally, and necessarily, regardless of our desires or the particular circumstances. It doesn't say if you want to be a good person, then do X. It simply says do X, because X is what a rational, moral agent must do. This is the cornerstone of Kant's ethics. He believed there was one supreme categorical imperative, from which all other moral duties could be derived, and he offered several formulations of this single imperative, each shedding light on a different facet of moral law. Let's delve into the three most pertinent formulations for our discussion, especially concerning the trolley problem. The first, and perhaps most famous, is the formula of universal law. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law without contradiction. What does this mean? Before you act, you should consider the underlying principle, or maxim, of your action. Then you should ask yourself, what if everyone acted on this maxim all the time in every similar situation? If this universalized maxim would lead to a logical contradiction, or if you couldn't rationally will such a world, then your original action is immoral. Think about lying. If your maxim is, I will lie when it's convenient for me, and you universalize this, you quickly run into a contradiction. If everyone lied whenever it suited them, the very concept of truth-telling and thus the possibility of lying would collapse. Communication itself would break down. You couldn't rationally will a world where your lie works, because a world of universal lying would render all statements untrustworthy. Therefore, lying is generally immoral. The second and arguably most impactful for the trolley problem is the formula of humanity. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. This is profound. Kant is not saying we can never use people as means. We use the bus driver as a means to get to our destination, or the cashier as a means to buy groceries. This is fine, because the driver and the cashier are also pursuing their own ends. They are consenting, autonomous agents who have chosen their roles. We are treating them as means, but also as ends in themselves. What Kant prohibits is treating someone merely as a means. This means using a person solely as an instrument to achieve your goals, without any regard for their own rationality, their autonomy, their inherent value. It means denying their status as a being with intrinsic worth, reducing them to an object, a tool. Each human being, by virtue of their rationality and capacity for moral agency, possesses an inherent dignity, an absolute worth that must be respected. This worth is not conferred by their usefulness, their beauty, or their intelligence. It is intrinsic to their humanity. The third formulation, often called the formula of autonomy or kingdom of ends. Therefore, every rational being must so act as if he were through his maxim always a legislating member in the universal kingdom of ends. This formulation synthesizes the previous two. It imagines a kingdom or community where all rational beings treat themselves and others as ends, and all act according to universalizable laws that they themselves, as rational agents, have legislated. It emphasizes that we are not just subjects of the moral law, but also its authors. Our moral freedom lies in our capacity to give the law to ourselves. Now, let's bring these powerful, yet abstract, ideas down to the grim reality of the trolley problem. Consider the classic fat man scenario. A runaway trolley is headed for 5 workers. You are standing on a bridge next to a very large man. If you push him onto the tracks, his bulk will stop the trolley, saving the 5, but he will die. From a utilitarian perspective, this is a straightforward calculation, 1 life for 5. Many utilitarians would reluctantly but firmly advocate pushing the man, but what would Kant say? His answer would be an unequivocal and absolute no. The act of pushing the fat man directly violates the formula of humanity. You are using him merely as a means to an end. His body becomes a tool, a human shield, an object to stop the trolley. His inherent dignity, his autonomy, his absolute right to life are completely disregarded for the sake of a greater good. You are not treating him as an end in himself, as a rational being whose life has intrinsic worth, but rather as an instrument, a disposable cog in your life-saving machine. For Kant, this is fundamentally immoral, a profound affront to what it means to be human. The act itself is wrong, regardless of how many lives it might save. The moral law, do not murder, or do not treat humanity merely as a means, is absolute. Now let's turn to the lever scenario. The trolley is headed for 5. You can pull a lever to divert it onto a side track where it will kill 1 worker instead. This is where things get a bit more complex for strict deontology. A very strict Kantian might still find pulling the lever problematic. If the act of pulling the lever is interpreted as a direct act of causing the death of the one, even if you don't intend their death but merely foresee it, it could still be seen as violating a negative duty not to kill. The focus remains on the nature of the act itself, not just the intent or the outcome. Causing death, even of 1 to save 5, is still causing death. The moral law might seem to prohibit any direct act of ending a life. However, many deontologists, even those deeply influenced by Kant, often seek to differentiate this case from the fat man. They might argue that in the lever scenario, you are not directly using the one person as a means. You are not pushing them into the path of danger. Instead, you are redirecting a threat. The trolley is already a threat, and you are choosing to redirect it to the path of lesser harm, rather than initiating a new harm. The death of the one is a tragic, foreseen side effect of diverting the trolley, not the direct means by which the 5 are saved. The intention is to save the 5, and the death of the one, while regrettable, is not the intended mechanism of salvation. This distinction between directly causing harm as a means and foreseeing harm as a side effect becomes crucial. And this is precisely where we introduce a powerful and venerable concept known as the doctrine of double effect, or DDE. The doctrine of double effect has a rich history, dating back to medieval scholastic philosophy, notably to Thomas Aquinas, centuries before the trolley problem was even conceived. It was initially developed to address issues like self-defense or fighting in a just war, where a morally permissible act, like defending oneself, might have a foreseen, yet unintended negative consequence, like killing an attacker. It provides a framework for evaluating actions that have both good and bad effects, and it is absolutely crucial for understanding why many people find the lever permissible but the fat man impermissible within a non-consequentialist framework. The DDE states that an action that has both a good effect and a bad effect is morally permissible if and only if four conditions are met. First, the nature of the act must be good or morally neutral. The action itself, apart from its consequences, must not be intrinsically evil. For instance, torture is an intrinsically evil act, regardless of its potential good outcomes, like gaining information. In the trolley lever case, pulling a lever is a morally neutral physical action. Pushing a person off a bridge, however, might be considered intrinsically wrong by some, or at least a direct act of aggression. Second, the agent's intention must be only for the good effect, not the bad effect. The bad effect must be merely foreseen, but not intended as a means to the good effect, nor as an end in itself. This is perhaps the most critical condition. When you pull the lever, your intention is to save the 5 workers. You foresee that one person will die, but you do not intend their death. Their death is not what you are aiming for. It is an unavoidable side effect of achieving your primary goal. In the fat man scenario, however, you do intend for the fat man to die, or at least for his body to be used as the means to stop the trolley. His death or his use as an obstacle is the very mechanism by which the 5 are saved. Therefore, the fat man scenario fails this condition. Third, the good effect must not be achieved by means of the bad effect. This means the bad effect cannot be the causal pathway to the good effect. The good effect must flow directly from the action or from the good effect of the action. To clarify, in the lever case, the action of diverting the trolley directly saves the 5. The death of the one is a separate, although linked, consequence of the redirection. The death of the one is not what causes the 5 to be saved. The 5 are saved because the trolley is not on their track. In the fat man case, the 5 are saved because the fat man's body stops the trolley. His death is the direct means to their salvation. This is where the crucial distinction lies for many deontologists. Fourth, there must be a proportionately grave reason for permitting the bad effect. The good effect must be sufficiently important to justify permitting the bad effect. This condition introduces a consequentialist element, requiring a kind of balancing act, but it's a secondary consideration, only applied after the first 3 deontological conditions are met. In the trolley scenario, saving 5 lives is generally considered a sufficiently grave reason to permit the foreseen, unintended death of one, assuming the other conditions are met. So, applying the DDE to the trolley problem. For the fat man scenario, it clearly fails condition 2 and 3. Your intention is for his body to stop the trolley, using him as a means, and his death is the means by which the 5 are saved. Thus, pushing the fat man is impermissible. For the lever scenario, 1. Nature of the act, pulling a lever is morally neutral. 2. Intention, your intention is to save the 5, not to kill the 1. The death of the 1 is foreseen but not intended. 3. Means end. The 5 are saved by the trolley being diverted, not by the death of the 1. The death of the 1 is a regrettable side effect. 4. Proportionality, saving 5 lives is a grave reason to permit the foreseen death of 1. Therefore, within the framework of DDE, the lever scenario is often considered permissible, even for non-consequentialists. This distinction helps to explain why many people intuitively feel a significant moral difference between the 2 cases, even if they can't immediately articulate the philosophical reasons. Beyond Kant and the DDE, other thinkers have contributed to the strength of deontological arguments. Robert Nozick, a prominent 20th century philosopher, championed the concept of rights as side constraints. For Nozick, individual rights, like the right to life or liberty, are not merely things to be considered in a utilitarian calculus. Rather, they are absolute boundaries or side constraints that limit what anyone can do to an individual. You cannot violate a person's rights, even if doing so would lead to a greater overall good. This directly resonates with Kant's idea of treating humanity as an end in itself. Pushing the fat man violates his absolute right to life, an inviolable side constraint, regardless of the consequences. Nozick's work provides a robust framework for understanding the protection of individual liberties within a deontological system. Another philosopher, Thomas Nagel, while not a strict deontologist, explored concepts like moral luck and the problem of dirty hands. These ideas touch on the practical difficulties of adhering to strict deontological duties in a messy world. Nagel points out that the moral quality of our actions can sometimes depend on factors beyond our control, moral luck, and that in certain situations, especially in politics, leaders might be forced to commit acts that are morally reprehensible from a deontological standpoint, getting dirty hands, in order to prevent even greater harm. This doesn't necessarily undermine deontology, but highlights the tragic choices that can arise when absolute moral rules collide with dire circumstances, a tension that deontology struggles with. So what are the central arguments for deontology when confronting scenarios like the trolley problem? First, and perhaps most powerfully, deontology upholds the inherent dignity and rights of individuals. It insists that every person possesses an intrinsic worth that cannot be overridden or sacrificed for the greater good of others. This prevents the instrumentalization of human beings, ensuring that they are always seen as subjects with their own ends, never merely as objects or tools. It gives moral weight to the idea that a person's life is their own, not a resource to be allocated. Second, it provides clear moral boundaries and prohibitions. Rules like do not kill, do not lie, do not steal provide a strong framework for ethical behavior. These are not contingent on calculations of outcome, which can be uncertain, but are absolute commands that offer moral clarity. This provides a sense of security and predictability in moral decision-making. Third, deontology often resonates with our deep-seated intuition that certain actions are inherently wrong, regardless of consequences. Many people feel a visceral recoil at the thought of pushing the fat man, even if it saves 5. This isn't necessarily a calculation of utility, but an immediate recognition that some acts are simply an affront to human dignity. Deontology explains and validates this intuition. Fourth, it effectively avoids the tyranny of the majority by protecting minorities and individuals. In a purely utilitarian framework, it's theoretically possible to justify profound injustices against a small group or individual if it benefits a larger population. Deontology, with its emphasis on individual rights and duties, acts as a bulwark against such scenarios, ensuring that the rights of even one person cannot be trampled for the sake of the many. This profound commitment to individual rights and duties finds expression in many real-world applications and systems we value deeply. Consider, for example, the principle of informed consent in medicine. This is a deeply deontological concept. It insists that a patient must freely and knowingly agree to medical treatment, even if a doctor believes a particular treatment is clearly in their best interest, and even if refusing it might lead to a worse outcome. The patient's autonomy, their right to make decisions about their own body, is paramount. You cannot treat someone merely as a means to their own health, overriding their will. Similarly, the prohibition against torture, even if it could potentially yield valuable information that saves many lives, is a powerfully deontological stance. Most modern societies reject torture as intrinsically immoral. It treats the individual solely as an instrument for information, an object to be manipulated, utterly disregarding their dignity and inherent worth. The act itself is wrong, regardless of the potential good it might achieve. The very concept of universal human rights, rights to life, liberty, freedom from torture, freedom of speech is profoundly deontological. These are not rights granted by governments or contingent on social utility. They are seen as inherent to every human being, simply by virtue of their humanity. These rights place obligations on states and individuals, regardless of perceived benefits or costs. The development of international human rights law post-World War II, in the wake of atrocities that showed what happens when individual dignity is disregarded, stands as a monumental historical example of a global commitment to a deontological framework. And finally, our legal systems themselves, with their emphasis on due process, fairness, and individual liberty, are infused with deontological principles. The presumption of innocence, the right to a fair trial, prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment, these are all rules designed to protect the individual, not merely to optimize societal outcomes. The legal system seeks to uphold justice and rights, even if, in a particular case, bending the rules might seem to yield a more efficient or beneficial outcome. Despite these strengths, deontology is not without its significant counterarguments and challenges. One of the most persistent criticisms is its rigidity and the problem of conflicting duties. What happens when two moral duties clash? For instance, you have a duty not to lie, but you also have a duty to prevent harm. Imagine a situation where lying to a would-be murderer about the whereabouts of their intended victim is the only way to save a life. A strict Kantian might argue that one must not lie, even in such extreme circumstances, potentially leading to an outcome that most people would find morally reprehensible. Deontology can struggle to provide clear guidance in such tragic dilemmas, appearing inflexible or even callous to the catastrophic consequences of adhering strictly to a rule. This is where the notion of dirty hands from Thomas Nagel becomes particularly salient, the idea that sometimes any action you take will be morally compromised. A second major counterargument is deontology's neglect of consequences. While its strength lies in its independence from outcomes, this can also be its greatest weakness. Critics argue that a moral philosophy that utterly ignores the results of actions is incomplete, if not irresponsible. If strictly following a rule leads to an outcome that is demonstrably worse, for example, letting 5 people die to avoid directly killing one, many find it difficult to accept such a conclusion. This is the core utilitarian critique. How can an action be truly moral if it leads to greater suffering or less overall good? The trolley problem itself, particularly the lever scenario, directly pits this tension against our intuitions. Third, the distinction between direct and indirect action, or intended versus foreseen harm, which is crucial for the doctrine of double effect, can be blurry and open to interpretation. Critics argue that it can be a convenient philosophical dodge, a way to rationalize actions that feel intuitively right, like pulling the lever, while condemning others that feel intuitively wrong, like pushing the fat man, without truly engaging with the difficult moral choices. For instance, is the death of the one on the side track truly unintended if it's a certainty? Can we honestly claim not to intend something that we know will inevitably happen as a direct result of our deliberate action? The application of the DDE can become highly subtle, leading to philosophical hair-splitting that feels disconnected from the urgency of the moral dilemma. Finally, there is the problem of moral absolutes. Are there truly universal moral rules that admit no exceptions, even in the most extreme or bizarre circumstances? What if a situation arose where violating a rule, say, do not lie, was the only way to prevent a global catastrophe? Deontology's insistence on absolute prohibitions can feel overly dogmatic in a world of moral shades of gray and highly complex scenarios. Many argue that a robust moral system must, at some level, be responsive to the unique demands of particular contexts and the potential for catastrophic outcomes. Before we conclude our journey through deontology, let's reflect on some historical context and anecdotes that underscore its development and impact. Immanuel Kant, as we mentioned, operated within the intellectual ferment of the 18th century Enlightenment. This was a period characterized by a profound belief in human reason, individual liberty, and a departure from traditional, dogmatic authority. Kant's philosophy can be seen as an ambitious attempt to provide a purely rational, secular foundation for morality, liberating ethics from dependence on religious revelation or empirical observation. He sought to discover moral laws that were as certain and universal as the laws of physics, derived not from what is the case, but from what ought to be the case, dictated by reason itself. His emphasis on autonomy, the idea that individuals are self-legislating moral agents, was revolutionary and deeply aligned with the spirit of an age championing individual freedom and responsibility. A powerful, if tragic, historical anecdote illustrating the practical application and enduring relevance of deontological principles is the development of international human rights law after World War II. The atrocities committed during the Holocaust and other genocides revealed the horrific consequences of societies that disregard the inherent dignity and rights of individuals, treating entire groups merely as means to political or ideological ends. In response, the international community crafted documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration and subsequent human rights treaties enshrined universal and inalienable rights, establishing a powerful deontological framework that asserts certain fundamental protections for every person, simply because they are human, irrespective of their nationality, ethnicity, or any other characteristic. These are not utilitarian calculations, they are statements of inherent worth and obligation. And finally, returning to the doctrine of double effect, it's important to remember its long intellectual pedigree. While Philippa Foot brought it back into prominence in the 20th century with her seminal work on the trolley problem, the DDE itself originated centuries earlier within Christian ethical traditions, particularly with Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. He used it to analyze the morality of self-defense, arguing that one could legitimately defend oneself, the good effect, even if it foreseeably resulted in the death of the attacker, the bad effect, provided the intention was solely to preserve one's own life, not to kill the assailant, and the force used was proportional. These long-standing theological debates demonstrate that the human mind has grappled with the distinction between intended and foreseen consequences, and the moral weight of direct versus indirect action, for many centuries before it found its way into modern philosophical dilemmas. As we conclude this segment on deontology, let's briefly touch upon its relationship with other ethical frameworks. We've seen how it stands as a direct philosophical foil to utilitarianism, prioritizing duties and rights over consequences. It also has a close affinity with rights-based ethics, which can be seen as a specific application or offshoot of deontological principles, grounding moral claims in the entitlements of individuals. In contrast, virtue ethics, which we'll explore in a future segment, shifts the focus from rules and duties, deontology, or outcomes, consequentialism, to the character of the moral agent. What kind of person should I be? Deontology offers a robust, principled, and often intuitively appealing framework for moral decision-making. It champions the individual, sets clear boundaries, and insists on the inherent dignity of every human being. Yet its rigidity and occasional inability to navigate conflicting duties or dire consequences present significant challenges. It leaves us with profound questions. Can we truly separate our intentions from the foreseeable outcomes of our actions? And what happens when strict adherence to duty seems to lead to a morally worse world? These are the enduring tensions that make the philosophy of the trolley problem so compelling and so resistant to easy answers. So far, we've wrestled with the fundamental tension at the heart of the trolley problem: the cold, calculating consequences of utilitarianism versus the unwavering duties and rights central to deontology. But what if these two giants don't tell the whole story? What if the very structure of the dilemma, forcing us to choose between two dreadful outcomes, obscures deeper moral truths? Today, we're going to step beyond this binary to explore how other significant ethical frameworks engage with the trolley problem, offering richer, more nuanced perspectives. We'll delve into the character of the moral agent, the inherent rights of individuals, the hypothetical agreements that underpin society, and the profound importance of our relationships with one another. Each of these approaches, in its own way, challenges the simple arithmetic of lives saved versus lives lost, inviting us to look not just at what we do, but why and how we do it, and what kind of people we become in the process. Let's begin with virtue ethics. Unlike utilitarianism, which focuses on the consequences of actions, or deontology, which zeroes in on the inherent rightness or wrongness of the actions themselves, virtue ethics fundamentally shifts the lens. It asks not what should I do, but rather what kind of person should I be, or more precisely, what would a virtuous person do in this situation? It's a philosophy deeply concerned with the character of the moral agent, the inner moral compass, and the cultivation of virtues like compassion, courage, justice, wisdom, and prudence. The origins of virtue ethics stretch back to ancient Greece, most famously articulated by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics. For Aristotle, the ultimate goal of human life, telos, was eudaimonia, often translated as flourishing or living well. And to achieve eudaimonia, one had to cultivate virtues. A virtue, for Aristotle, was a mean between two extremes. Courage, for instance, lies between cowardice and recklessness. It wasn't about following a rigid rule, but about developing practical wisdom, or phronses, to know how to act virtuously in specific contexts. We become courageous by performing courageous acts, just as we become skilled musicians by playing music. As Aristotle famously said, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit. Now, applying this to the trolley problem offers a fascinating departure from our previous discussions. A virtue ethicist isn't primarily concerned with whether pulling the lever or pushing the fat man results in the greatest good or adheres to universal moral law. Instead, they would scrutinize the decision-making process itself, the agent's motives, and how the choice reflects or cultivates their character. What virtues are at play here? Compassion, certainly, for those in danger, justice in how lives are weighed, courage in making a terrifying choice, prudence in assessing the situation. Consider the person faced with the lever. A virtuous person wouldn't pull it impulsively or out of a cold calculation. They would grapple with the immense emotional weight, acknowledge the tragedy, and act with a sense of responsibility and compassion, even in the face of an impossible choice. The act itself, regardless of the outcome, would be an expression of their developed character. If they pull the lever with a heavy heart, motivated by a deep sense of compassion and a desire to minimize suffering, that reflects a different moral character than someone who acts with detached indifference or even malicious intent. This approach recognizes the emotional toll of such dilemmas, something often overlooked by the more abstract frameworks. A virtuous person would feel the gravity of taking a life, even indirectly, and that feeling is itself a part of their moral compass. The focus shifts from the abstract problem to the concrete person facing it. What kind of person emerges from this ordeal? One who has acted with integrity, compassion, and practical wisdom, even if the outcome remains tragic. A powerful example of virtue ethics in action isn't found in a hypothetical trolley, but in the leadership of real-world figures. Imagine a political leader during a crisis, facing a decision that will undoubtedly cause suffering, but is deemed necessary for the long-term well-being of their community. A utilitarian leader might simply crunch the numbers. A deontological leader might seek a universal rule. But a virtuous leader would approach the decision not just with calculation or duty, but with profound wisdom, courage to make the hard choice, justice in considering all affected, and a deep-seated compassion for those who will suffer. Their character, cultivated over a lifetime, would guide their approach, ensuring that even a painful decision is made with integrity and a recognition of human dignity. However, virtue ethics isn't without its critics. One of the main counterarguments is its perceived lack of prescriptive power. It tells us to be virtuous, but what exactly does a virtuous person do when virtues conflict? In the trolley problem, for instance, a virtuous person would feel compassion for the one person and compassion for the five. How do these virtues resolve the dilemma? It doesn't offer a clear do this instruction, which can be frustrating when faced with an urgent life or death choice. Another critique is that the definition of what constitutes a virtue can vary across cultures and traditions, potentially leading to a degree of relativism, though proponents would argue for a core set of universal human virtues. The modern revival of virtue ethics in the latter half of the 20th century, particularly with philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre, was a powerful response to what he saw as the moral incoherence of contemporary society. In his seminal work After Virtue, MacIntyre argued that modern ethical discourse, dominated by utilitarianism and deontology, had lost its way, becoming fragmented and unmoored from any coherent tradition or concept of human flourishing. He advocated for a return to an Aristotelian understanding of virtues, embedded within specific social practices and communities, to restore meaning to moral life. This revival offered a fresh perspective, directly challenging the abstract, impersonal nature of other dominant ethical theories by insisting that the moral life is lived by concrete individuals with particular characters. It reminds us that our moral theories shouldn't neglect the human being at their center. Moving from the character of the agent to the inherent dignity of individuals, we turn to rights-based ethics. This framework, while often seen as an extension or specific application of deontology, places a distinct and paramount emphasis on the concept of inherent, inalienable rights. These are entitlements that individuals possess simply by virtue of being human, rights that are not granted by governments or societies, but exist independently and serve as crucial moral protections. The most fundamental of these include the right to life, liberty, and bodily autonomy. The historical roots of rights-based ethics are deeply intertwined with the Enlightenment era, particularly with thinkers like John Locke. Locke argued for natural rights, the rights to life, health, liberty, and property, which he believed existed even in a state of nature, and formed the basis for legitimate government. For Locke, government's primary purpose was to protect these pre-existing rights, not to create them. As he stated, being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. This idea of individual rights as inviolable moral boundaries gained immense traction, shaping revolutionary movements and foundational documents like the American Declaration of Independence. In the 20th century, philosophers like Ronald Dworkin further developed this concept, famously asserting that rights are trumps, meaning they override appeals to collective utility or the greater good. If someone has a right, it cannot be overridden simply because violating it would produce a slightly better outcome for more people. Robert Nozick, another key figure, articulated a strong libertarian version of rights, seeing them as side constraints on action. This means that rights define the moral boundaries within which we must operate. We cannot violate someone's rights, even if doing so would lead to a more desirable overall state of affairs. His entitlement theory of justice, for instance, argues that holdings are just if they are acquired through just original acquisition or just transfer, and any redistribution for the sake of equality, if it violates these rights, is unjust. When we apply rights-based ethics to the trolley problem, the implications become stark, especially in the fat man scenario. Pushing the fat man off the bridge to save 5 others is a clear, undeniable violation of his fundamental right to life and bodily autonomy. His body is his own. It is not a resource to be exploited or sacrificed, even for a purportedly greater good. From a rights perspective, the 5 people on the track do not have a right to his life. His right to life acts as a moral side constraint on our actions. It prohibits us from actively using him as a means to save others, regardless of the numerical outcome. This directly opposes the utilitarian calculus, which would likely endorse the push if it maximizes overall happiness. The lever scenario is more nuanced, but still involves a conflict of rights. By pulling the lever, you're still making a choice that results in one person's death, thereby impacting their right to life. However, the direct, active violation of an individual's bodily integrity and agency is less pronounced than in the fat man case. It's a choice between two bad outcomes where rights are inevitably impacted, but the rights framework would still emphasize the inherent value of each life rather than just the sum. Real-world applications of rights-based ethics are pervasive, often forming the bedrock of legal systems and international humanitarian efforts. Consider legal arguments surrounding bodily autonomy, the right of an individual to control their own body and make decisions about their health care, free from coercion. This principle is fundamental to informed consent in medicine, where even if a treatment could save a life, it cannot be administered without the patient's permission. Similarly, the right to privacy, the right to a fair trial, and the freedom of speech are all examples of rights that are often protected even when their exercise might not yield the most efficient or beneficial outcome for the collective. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, born out of the horrors of World War II, stands as a monumental testament to the global commitment to protecting the inherent dignity and rights of every individual, explicitly countering any philosophy that would treat individuals as expendable for the sake of the state or the majority. The primary counterargument against rights-based ethics, particularly in the context of dilemmas like the trolley problem, emerges when rights conflict. What happens when the right to life of one person clashes with the right to life of 5 others? If all rights are absolute trumps, then we find ourselves in an intractable situation where any action violates a right. This framework can become so rigid that it offers no clear guidance when fundamental rights are pitted against each other, potentially leading to paralysis or counterintuitive outcomes where upholding one right at all costs leads to greater overall harm. Some critics argue that an overly absolutist view of rights fails to account for the tragic choices sometimes required in moral life, and that a more nuanced understanding of prima facie rights, which can be overridden in extreme circumstances, is necessary. The historical development of human rights documents and movements, from the English Bill of Rights to the American and French Revolutions, and culminating in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, highlights both the enduring appeal and the ongoing challenges of grounding morality in individual rights. These movements consistently fought against abuses of power and the sacrificing of individuals for the sake of collective ideologies, demonstrating the profound importance of treating each person as an end in themselves, a concept we also saw reflected in Kantian deontology. Rights-based ethics offers a powerful, individualistic bulwark against the potential tyranny of the majority inherent in purely consequentialist frameworks. Now, let's explore a framework that asks what kind of moral rules we would collectively agree upon. Contractarianism and contractualism. This ethical approach grounds morality not in individual character, consequences, or inherent duties, but in a hypothetical social contract. It asks, what moral rules would rational individuals agree to, under fair conditions, to govern their interactions and structure their society? The underlying premise is that morality is essentially a set of principles that people would voluntarily choose to abide by for mutual benefit, rather than something externally imposed or intuitively discovered. While the idea of a social contract has a long history, going back to thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, its modern articulation for ethics is most powerfully found in the works of John Rawls and T.M. Scanlon. John Rawls, in his groundbreaking 1971 work A Theory of Justice, introduced the concept of the original position and the veil of ignorance. Imagine a group of rational, self-interested individuals tasked with designing the fundamental principles of justice for their society. To ensure fairness, they operate behind a veil of ignorance, meaning they are unaware of their own particular circumstances, their race, gender, social status, wealth, talents, or even their personal conception of the good life. They don't know if they will be rich or poor, healthy or sick, powerful or marginalized. Under these conditions, Rawls argued, these rational agents would choose 2 main principles of justice. First, equal basic liberties for all, and second, social and economic inequalities are only permissible if they benefit the least advantaged and are attached to positions open to all under fair equality of opportunity, the difference principle. How does this apply to the trolley problem? If rational agents behind a veil of ignorance were asked to establish a principle regarding the sacrifice of innocent individuals, would they agree to a rule that permits actively sacrificing one person to save 5? Rawls would argue they likely would not. Why? Because not knowing whether they would be the one or one of the five, they would choose principles that maximize their own minimum outcome, a maximin strategy. The risk of being the innocent person sacrificed is too great. They would prioritize principles that guarantee basic rights and protections for every individual, ensuring that no one could be treated as a mere means to an end or be sacrificed for the collective good. This framework, therefore, tends to strongly oppose actions like pushing the fat man and would make the lever scenario very problematic, as it undermines the security and fundamental rights of individuals in the society. T.M. Scanlon, in his work What We Owe to Each Other, developed a distinct form of contractualism. His central question is not what principles people would agree to, but what principles no one could reasonably reject. An action is wrong, according to Scanlon, if its performance under the circumstances would be disallowed by any set of principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one could reasonably reject as a basis for informed, unforced general agreement. The emphasis here is on justifiability to others. In the context of the trolley problem, particularly the fat man scenario, Scanlon's contractualism provides a powerful argument against pushing. Could the person pushed off the bridge reasonably reject a principle that permits their sacrifice for the greater good of five strangers? Absolutely. No rational individual, understanding the implications, would agree to a principle that allows them to be involuntarily sacrificed in such a manner. They could reasonably reject it because it treats them as a mere fungible resource rather than a person with inherent worth. The most tangible examples of contractarianism in the real world involve the design of just social institutions. Modern constitutional democracies, with their emphasis on rule of law, protection of individual rights, and democratic processes, can be seen as attempts to embody principles that citizens would, in theory, agree to. The structure of a fair healthcare system, the principles governing property rights, or even the rules of engagement in international law can all be analyzed through a contractarian lens. Would rational, self-interested parties agree to these rules from a position of fairness? However, contractarianism faces its own significant counterarguments. One major critique, particularly of Rawls's veil of ignorance, is whether it's truly achievable or if it's just another abstraction. Can human beings truly shed all their personal biases, experiences, and self-interest to arrive at perfectly impartial principles? Critics argue that our moral reasoning is always, to some extent, shaped by who we are and where we come from, making the original position a highly idealized and perhaps unattainable thought experiment. Another critique is that while it provides a robust framework for macro-level justice, the design of fair societies, it might be less clear or effective when dealing with highly specific, individual moral dilemmas like the trolley problem, which involve immediate action rather than the drafting of long-term societal rules. The intellectual environment that led to Rawls's A theory of justice was steeped in the aftermath of 2 world wars and the civil rights movement, seeking a robust liberal political philosophy that could withstand the critiques of utilitarianism's potential for sacrificing individuals and provide a strong foundation for social justice. Rawls's work became a landmark, shifting philosophical focus back to distributive justice and individual rights in a way that had been largely absent from analytic philosophy for decades. It offered a sophisticated alternative to both utilitarianism and intuitive deontology by attempting to ground moral and political principles in a rational, hypothetical agreement. Finally, let's explore an ethical framework that challenges the very premise of abstract, impartial moral reasoning, care ethics. Care ethics is a framework that emphasizes relationships, empathy, responsiveness, and context over abstract rules, impartial calculations, or universal principles. It critiques the traditional, often male-dominated ethical theories, like those of Kant or the utilitarians, for being too abstract, individualistic, rationalistic, and detached, arguing that they often neglect the lived realities of human moral experience, which is fundamentally relational. Its origins lie largely in feminist critiques of traditional ethics, particularly in the work of psychologist Carol Gilligan. In her seminal 1982 book, In a Different Voice, Gilligan challenged Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development, which suggested that abstract, rule-based reasoning was the highest form of moral thought. Gilligan argued that Kohlberg's model, developed primarily through studies of male subjects, failed to adequately account for a distinct ethic of care that she observed more frequently in women. This ethic emphasized connection, responsibility for others, and the maintenance of relationships, rather than just rights and rules. It highlighted a different way of understanding morality, one rooted in interdependence rather than autonomy. Nell Noddings, another prominent care ethicist, further developed this idea in her book Caring, a feminine approach to ethics and moral education. She argued that the fundamental moral orientation should be towards caring relationships, where the one caring genuinely responds to the needs of the cared for. For Nottings, moral decisions arise not from abstract principles, but from the specific, concrete demands of a given relationship. As she put it, we are not trying to decide how we should live with other people in general, but how we should live with this other person. When applied to the trolley problem, care ethics doesn't just offer an alternative solution. It fundamentally critiques the problem itself. The trolley problem, with its anonymous individuals and detached, hypothetical setup, is seen as precisely the kind of abstract dilemma that care ethics finds problematic. Real moral dilemmas, a care ethicist would argue, involve specific individuals with histories, relationships, and emotional connections. Reducing them to numbers on a track divorces the situation from its human reality. A care ethicist would focus on several key aspects: relationality and empathy. Who are these people on the track? Do I have a relationship with any of them? Would my decision affect my loved ones or my community? The emotional resonance of the situation, the empathy felt for all involved, would be central. Context, the specific circumstances, the identities of the individuals, and the nature of the emergency all matter. A universal rule that applies blindly to all situations might be less valuable than a nuanced, context-sensitive response, minimizing harm within relationships. The goal might not be to maximize impersonal good, but to minimize disruption and harm within existing or potential relationships, and to uphold the responsibilities that arise from those connections. Emotional toll. Care ethics acknowledges the profound emotional burden of making such a decision. The anguish, guilt, and grief are not external noise, but integral parts of the moral experience. It questions the very premise of impartiality that other frameworks often champion, suggesting that a degree of partiality towards those we care for is not only natural but morally defensible, and perhaps even necessary for a humane society. An excellent example of care ethics in action is a parent making a difficult choice for their child. Imagine a parent facing a medical decision that could save their child but involves significant risk or hardship. Their decision is not driven by an impartial calculation of overall utility, nor solely by universal duties, but by an overwhelming sense of love, responsibility, and intimate knowledge of their child's specific needs and personality. They prioritize their child's well-being above abstract principles or the welfare of strangers, and this is widely seen not as favoritism, but as a morally commendable act of care. Similarly, a doctor who has developed a long-term, caring relationship with a patient might make different recommendations than a doctor who views the patient as an anonymous case, reflecting a deeper understanding of the patient's values and wishes. The counterarguments against care ethics often center on its perceived subjectivity and potential for favoritism. Critics argue that by emphasizing personal relationships and context, care ethics might lead to biased decision-making, where the needs of one's own family or community are prioritized over the needs of strangers, potentially neglecting universal principles of justice and fairness. If moral choices are always contextual and relational, how can we establish general moral guidelines or address large-scale injustices involving anonymous populations? There's also the concern that the constant emotional burden of caring might lead to burnout for the moral agent. The historical anecdote here is the rise of second-wave feminism and the accompanying critiques of traditional, abstract ethics. Feminist philosophers and psychologists argued that existing ethical theories were often built upon a masculine ideal of the autonomous, rational individual, neglecting the experiences and perspectives of women, particularly their roles in nurturing and maintaining relationships. This intellectual ferment led to a reevaluation of what constitutes moral excellence, challenging the notion that impartiality and abstract reasoning are always the highest forms of moral wisdom. Care ethics emerged as a powerful voice advocating for recognition of interconnectedness and empathy as fundamental moral virtues. So, where does this leave us with the trolley problem? Each of these frameworks offers a profound critique and alternative perspective to the utilitarian deontological dichotomy. Virtue ethics reminds us that the moral agent's character and motives are paramount. It asks not just what action is right, but what kind of person performs that action. It challenges the cold calculus by insisting on the importance of human emotion, compassion, and practical wisdom in navigating moral quandaries, offering a richness that impersonal algorithms often miss. It makes us pause and reflect on the moral integrity of the decision-maker, urging us to cultivate virtues that allow us to respond to tragedy with wisdom and humanity. Rights-based ethics provides an indispensable bulwark against any attempt to instrumentalize individuals for the collective good. It places strong moral side constraints on our actions, asserting that certain rights, like the right to life and bodily autonomy, are inviolable and cannot be overridden, even if doing so promises a better outcome for more people. It challenges utilitarianism's potential for sacrificing the individual and bolsters deontology's focus on inherent dignity, but grounds it in explicit entitlements. It demands that we treat each person as an end in themselves, never merely as a means. Contractarianism and contractualism offer a procedural approach, grounding moral principles in rational agreement under fair conditions. By asking what rules everyone would consent to, particularly from a position of profound uncertainty about their own fate, these frameworks provide a powerful argument against any principle that would allow for the arbitrary sacrifice of individuals. They challenge both utilitarianism's willingness to aggregate welfare and deontology's reliance on potentially subjective intuitions about duties, by seeking principles that are mutually justifiable and rational for all. And finally, care ethics delivers a fundamental challenge to the very structure of the trolley problem itself. It argues that abstract dilemmas, divorced from context and relationship, miss the essence of moral life. It brings attention to the profound importance of empathy, interconnectedness, and the responsibilities that arise from our specific relationships, pushing back against the ideal of an impartial, detached moral judge. It reminds us that our moral universe is often intensely personal, and that neglecting the emotional and relational dimensions of choice leads to an impoverished understanding of ethics. These frameworks don't necessarily provide a single, definitive solution to the trolley problem. Instead, they broaden our ethical lens, showing us that the dilemma is far more complex than a simple choice between 1 and 5. They highlight the irreducible value of individual lives, the profound importance of our character, the necessity of mutual respect and agreement, and the deep moral significance of our human connections. By exploring these diverse perspectives, we gain a much richer, more nuanced appreciation of the multifaceted nature of morality, moving beyond the binary and into the intricate tapestry of ethical thought. We've spent a considerable amount of time navigating the intricate pathways of normative ethics, wrestling with what we should do when faced with the agonizing choices of the trolley problem. We've dissected the cold calculus of utilitarianism and explored the unyielding principles of deontology. But what if our moral compass isn't solely guided by the deliberate application of these grand theories? What if beneath the surface of our conscious reasoning there's a deeper, more primal engine driving our responses? This is where our journey takes a fascinating turn, shifting from the philosopher's armchair to the scientist's laboratory. We're moving from the realm of ought to the realm of is, to explore what psychology and neuroscience reveal about the very mechanisms of our moral intuition. Prepare to enter the brain on a train, where we'll peer inside the human mind, seeking to understand the neural fireworks that ignite when we confront a runaway trolley. Our primary guide in this exploration is a remarkable figure, Joshua Green. Trained initially as a philosopher, Green found himself increasingly drawn to the empirical questions lurking beneath ethical debates. He realized that while philosophers were brilliant at constructing arguments for how we should act, they often neglected the question of how we actually do act, and more importantly, why. This curiosity led him to neuroscience, where he began to use cutting-edge tools, like functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to observe the living brain as it grappled with moral dilemmas. Green's groundbreaking work, often conducted at Princeton University, focused precisely on dilemmas like the trolley problem. He presented subjects with variations of the problem while they lay inside an fMRI scanner, which measures changes in blood flow to different parts of the brain, indicating neural activity. What he discovered was nothing short of revolutionary, suggesting a dual-process theory of moral judgment. Imagine, for a moment, two distinct scenarios. In the first, you're standing by the tracks and a runaway trolley is heading towards 5 people. You can pull a lever to divert it onto a side track where it will kill 1 person instead. This is often called the impersonal trolley dilemma. In the second scenario, you are on a footbridge overlooking the tracks. A trolley is hurtling towards 5 people. There's a very large man next to you. If you push him onto the tracks, his bulk will stop the trolley, saving the 5, but he will die. This is the personal dilemma, the fat man variant. What Green's fMRI studies revealed was a striking difference in how our brains respond to these two seemingly similar situations. When confronted with the impersonal dilemma pulling the lever, his subjects showed increased activity in brain regions associated with cognitive control and abstract reasoning, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, DLPFC. This area is involved in planning, problem-solving, and managing competing thoughts. This cognitive engagement, Green proposed, led many to arrive at a utilitarian conclusion. 1 death is regrettable, but 5 deaths are worse. The calculation here feels more like a logical puzzle. However, when presented with the personal dilemma pushing the fat man, a different set of brain regions lit up. Here, Green observed heightened activity in areas associated with emotion, social cognition, and self-referential processing. Key among these were the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, and the amygdala. The amygdala, often described as the brain's alarm system, is deeply involved in processing fear and other strong emotions. The VMPFC plays a crucial role in integrating emotion into decision-making and modulating social behavior. The response in this scenario was overwhelmingly negative, often leading to a deontological judgment. It is inherently wrong to intentionally use another person as a means to an end, regardless of the outcome. The thought of physically pushing someone feels viscerally wrong, evoking a strong emotional aversion. This difference, Green argued, is the essence of his dual process theory. He posited that our moral judgments are often the product of 2 competing systems. One, an ancient, fast-acting emotional system that generates strong intuitive responses, especially to up-close and personal moral violations. And the other, a more recently evolved, slower cognitive system that engages in conscious reasoning and cost-benefit analysis. When we face the fat man dilemma, our emotional system screams no, long before our cognitive system has a chance to fully weigh the utilitarian outcome. When we face the lever dilemma, the emotional activation is less intense, allowing our cognitive system more room to calculate and arrive at a different conclusion. The implications of these findings are profound. Are our cherished moral judgments, the very bedrock of our ethical systems, merely post hoc rationalizations of emotional responses? Do we feel a strong emotional pull and then construct a rational argument to justify that feeling? This question directly challenges centuries of philosophical tradition that often prioritized reason as the sole or primary arbiter of moral truth. This perspective resonates strongly with the work of another prominent thinker, Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist who developed the social intuitionist model of moral judgment. Haidt argues that moral judgments are primarily intuitive, almost instantaneous gut feelings. We see something, we feel something, a flash of approval or disapproval, and then our reasoning mind kicks in, not to discover the truth, but to construct a plausible justification for that initial intuition. Haidt famously uses the analogy of a rider conscious reasoning on an elephant unconscious intuition. The rider thinks they are in control, steering the elephant, but in reality, the elephant often goes where it wants, and the rider's job is simply to rationalize the elephant's path. Consider a simple example, seeing someone kick a dog. Most of us would immediately feel a surge of anger and disgust. Our intuition screams wrong. Only afterward might we articulate why it's wrong. It's cruel, the dog didn't deserve it, it causes unnecessary suffering. According to Haidt, the initial moral judgment is effective and automatic, and the reasoning is largely post hoc. Green's fMRI studies provide compelling neural evidence for this intuition-first model in the context of trolley dilemmas, suggesting that our deeply rooted emotional aversion to direct harm drives our deontological tendencies, while our more abstract reasoning system allows for utilitarian calculations when direct emotional engagement is minimized. This brings us to the work of Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel laureate economist and psychologist, whose distinctions between System 1 and System 2 thinking offer a powerful framework for understanding these dual processes. Kahneman describes System 1 as fast, intuitive, automatic, emotional, and often unconscious. It's what allows us to recognize faces, understand simple sentences, and react quickly to danger. System 2, on the other hand, is slow, effortful, deliberate, logical, and conscious. It's what we use for complex calculations, problem-solving, and sustained attention. In the context of the trolley problem, pushing the fat man might trigger an immediate System 1 fight or flight response, an automatic revulsion to direct physical harm. This is the emotional alarm bell Green observed in the amygdala and VMPFC. Pulling the lever, being more abstract and less personally engaging, might allow System 2 to activate more readily, enabling a slower, more deliberate calculation of consequences and the greater good, engaging the DLPFC. The trolley problem, therefore, becomes a fascinating arena where these 2 fundamental systems of human cognition clash, often leading to conflicting moral judgments that challenge our sense of coherent selfhood. Before Green and Haidt, there was already significant groundwork laid for understanding the critical role of emotion in reason, particularly by neurologist Antonio Damasio, in his seminal work Descartes' Error. Emotion, reason, and the human brain, Damasio argued against the traditional philosophical view that emotions are irrational forces that contaminate pure reason. Instead, he proposed that emotions are indispensable for rational decision-making. He introduced the concept of the somatic marker hypothesis, suggesting that our brain quickly attaches somatic markers, gut feelings, bodily sensations, or emotional valences to potential outcomes of our actions. These markers then guide our choices, helping us to navigate complex situations more efficiently than pure logic alone ever could. Damasio's insights came partly from studying patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, VMPFC, the very area Green later identified as crucial for emotional responses to personal moral dilemmas. These patients, despite having intact intellect and logical reasoning abilities, often exhibited severe impairments in real-world decision-making, particularly in social and personal contexts. They struggled to hold jobs, maintain relationships, and make sound financial choices. They could logically articulate the pros and cons of various options, but they couldn't seem to feel the difference, to experience the emotional push or pull that typically guides us towards beneficial outcomes and away from detrimental ones. Their reason was disembodied, leading to disastrous practical consequences. This provides a powerful neurological argument against the idea of purely rational moral agents and further underscores the intertwining of emotion and reason in our ethical lives. So let's consolidate the powerful arguments emerging from this empirical research. Firstly, moral intuitions are often automatic and emotional. The immediate revulsion we feel towards pushing someone to their death is not a carefully reasoned conclusion, but a deep-seated emotional response, a product of our evolutionary history that wired us to avoid direct interpersonal harm. This intuitive no often precedes any rational calculation. Secondly, the brain processes personal and impersonal moral dilemmas differently. Green's fMRI studies are the bedrock of this claim, showing distinct neural pathways lighting up depending on the nature of the moral challenge. The personal dilemmas activate emotional centers, while impersonal ones engage cognitive control regions. This differential processing explains why we might be willing to pull a lever but not push a man, even if the outcome is numerically identical. Thirdly, and following from hate, reasoning often serves to justify pre-existing intuitions. Our rational minds are masterful storytellers, capable of weaving elaborate justifications for beliefs and feelings we've already arrived at intuitively. When asked why we wouldn't push the fat man, we might cite deontological principles, but perhaps those principles are merely the sophisticated vocabulary we use to express a more fundamental, visceral aversion. Finally, the trolley problem highlights a profound conflict between emotional and cognitive systems within the human brain. It's not just a philosophical thought experiment. It's a window into an internal struggle, a battle between our ancient, fast-acting emotional circuits that prioritize avoiding direct harm, and our more recently evolved, slower cognitive circuits that seek to maximize overall welfare through dispassionate calculation. This conflict is what makes the dilemma so agonizing and so revealing. Let's delve deeper into some specific examples and further research that illustrate these points. Beyond Green's initial fMRI studies, numerous experiments have demonstrated how subtle changes in framing or emotional salience can dramatically alter moral judgments. For instance, studies have shown that people are less likely to pull a lever if the single person on the side track is explicitly named or if they know them personally. The introduction of emotional connection, even a minimal one, shifts the dilemma from a purely cognitive calculation to one infused with affective considerations. Similarly, dilemmas that involve direct physical contact, even if indirect, e.g., flipping a switch that causes a platform to drop a person, tend to elicit stronger emotional responses and more deontological judgments than dilemmas where the act is more removed, like pressing a button to remotely divert a drone strike. The perceived personalness of the act isn't just about physical contact, but also about intentionality. When harm is an intended means to an end, it triggers a different emotional and cognitive response than when it is a foreseeable side effect. Perhaps one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the role of emotion in moral judgment comes from studies on brain damage and psychopathy. We briefly touched on Damasio's work with VMPFC patients. Let's consider Phineas Gage, a historical anecdote often cited in neuroscience. In 1848, Gage, a railroad construction foreman, suffered a horrific accident where an iron rod pierced his skull, destroying much of his left frontal lobe, including parts of the VMPFC. Miraculously, he survived and retained his intellect, memory, and speech. However, his personality underwent a profound transformation. He became irresponsible, impulsive, prone to fits of profanity, and unable to make rational life choices, despite still being able to reason logically. He had lost his somatic markers, the emotional signals that guide sound decision-making, particularly in social and moral contexts. Phineas Gage provided an early, albeit tragic, insight into how damage to specific brain regions could decouple reasoning from the emotions crucial for ethical behavior. More recent studies have shown that individuals with similar damage to the VMPFC tend to respond to personal moral dilemmas in a strikingly utilitarian fashion. For example, when presented with the fat man variant of the trolley problem, these patients are significantly more likely than healthy controls to endorse pushing the man, because they lack the strong emotional aversion that typically inhibits such an action. Their cold, calculating logic isn't inhibited by the visceral wrongness that most of us feel. This isn't to say they are better at moral reasoning. Rather, it suggests a profound alteration in their moral landscape, underscoring the VMPFC's role in integrating emotions like empathy, guilt, and compassion into moral judgments. Similar patterns are observed in individuals with psychopathy, a personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy, shallow affect, and antisocial behavior. Research has shown that psychopaths, particularly those with reduced activity in emotional brain regions like the amygdala and VMPFC, often exhibit an enhanced utilitarian bias in personal moral dilemmas. They are less inhibited by the emotional revulsion of directly harming another person and are more likely to endorse actions that maximize outcomes, even if it involves severe personal harm to an individual. These findings suggest a neural basis for their characteristic lack of moral constraint and offer a chilling insight into what morality might look like without the guiding hand of emotion. Beyond individual neurological differences, cross-cultural studies on trolley dilemmas reveal both universal and culturally specific patterns. While the basic aversion to pushing the fat man seems to be a largely universal human intuition, the strength of this intuition and the willingness to override it for utilitarian ends can vary. For example, some studies suggest that individuals from collectivistic cultures, which emphasize group harmony and interconnectedness, might show slightly different patterns of response, perhaps being more sensitive to the welfare of the group as a whole or to the social implications of their choices. Other research explores how different cultural values, like honor or strict adherence to religious doctrines, can modulate the emotional and cognitive processing of these dilemmas. These studies highlight that while the fundamental neural machinery might be shared, its output is inevitably shaped by the specific cultural environment in which a person is raised. These empirical insights didn't emerge in a vacuum. They are part of a broader historical shift from purely armchair philosophy to interdisciplinary approaches. For centuries, philosophy was largely conducted through introspection, logic, and dialogue. But the advent of cognitive psychology in the mid-20th century, the cognitive revolution, spearheaded by figures like Noam Chomsky, George Miller, and Ulrich Neisser, began to treat the mind not as a black box, but as a system that processes information. This revolution, coupled with advances in neuroscience that allowed us to actually observe the brain in action, opened up entirely new avenues for exploring questions that were once the exclusive domain of philosophy. Questions about consciousness, free will, and indeed morality could now be tackled with empirical data, bridging the gap between the humanities and the sciences. This move towards experimental philosophy has fundamentally reshaped how we approach ethical inquiry. However, as compelling as these scientific findings are, they also present us with significant philosophical challenges and potential pitfalls. It's crucial to address some important counterarguments to the claims derived from empirical research. The most significant philosophical challenge is the is-ought problem, famously articulated by David Hume. Just because we can describe how we make moral judgments, that they are influenced by emotions, that different brain regions are activated, does not automatically tell us how we should make them. Empirical findings describe the is of human morality, its psychological and neurological underpinnings. They do not, by themselves, prescribe the ought, the normative principles we should follow. Knowing that our aversion to pushing the fat man is driven by emotional circuits doesn't inherently invalidate a deontological principle against using people as means. Nor does it definitively prove that utilitarianism, which might require such an act, is superior. The gap between descriptive facts and prescriptive values remains a formidable one, and neuroscience, for all its power, cannot simply leap across it. Another crucial point is the distinction between correlation and causation. When an fMRI scanner shows a particular brain region lighting up during a moral judgment, it indicates a correlation between that brain activity and the judgment. But is that activity causing the moral judgment, or is it merely accompanying it? It's incredibly difficult to isolate true causality in the complex, interconnected web of the brain. Perhaps the activated regions are simply engaged in processing the emotional or cognitive load, rather than directly generating the moral decision itself. This is often referred to as the problem of reverse inference in neuroscience, inferring the presence of a specific mental process from the activation of a specific brain region, which can be an oversimplification. A third concern is reductionism. Does reducing morality to brain states and neural activations oversimplify the rich, complex, and multifaceted nature of human ethical reasoning? Morality involves abstract concepts like justice, fairness, rights, and responsibility. It involves social norms, cultural narratives, personal narratives, and our capacity for deliberation, empathy, and self-reflection. If we simply say morality is just brain states, do we lose something fundamental about what it means to be a moral agent? Does it diminish our sense of free will, our capacity for moral growth, and the very meaning of ethical responsibility? While neuroscience offers invaluable insights into the biological substrates of morality, it may not encompass the entirety of what morality is as a human phenomenon. Finally, there's the issue of ecological validity. Do laboratory experiments, particularly those conducted within the constrained and artificial environment of an fMRI scanner, accurately reflect real-world moral decision-making? In the lab, participants are presented with highly simplified, often binary, hypothetical dilemmas. In real life, moral decisions are messy, involving incomplete information, ambiguous consequences, social pressures, personal relationships, and a vast array of contextual factors. It's one thing to answer a questionnaire about pushing a hypothetical fat man. It's quite another to face a real-time, high-stakes situation with real people and unforeseen consequences. The artificiality of the lab setting might inadvertently bias or oversimplify our understanding of how moral judgments unfold in naturalistic environments. These counterarguments remind us that while empirical science offers powerful tools to understand the mechanics of morality, it doesn't replace the deep philosophical work of grappling with its meaning and justification. Indeed, this interplay leads to fascinating cross-references with enduring philosophical debates. For instance, this empirical work speaks directly to metaethics, the branch of philosophy that investigates the nature of moral truth itself. If our moral judgments are largely driven by emotional intuitions, does this imply that moral truths are inherently subjective, merely expressions of our feelings or evolved predispositions? Or can these intuitions still point towards objective moral realities, perhaps serving as a moral compass that, while fallible, generally guides us towards what is good? The findings of Green and Haight rekindle the ancient debate between moral rationalism, that moral truths are discovered through reason, and moral empiricism, that moral knowledge derives from experience and observation, including our emotional responses. Furthermore, the discussion directly impacts debates about foundationalism in ethics, whether moral beliefs are ultimately based on reason, intuition, divine command, or some other bedrock. Green's dual-process theory and Haight's intuitionist model strongly suggest that intuition often provides the initial foundation, with reason then building elaborate structures upon it. This challenges traditional rationalist views that prioritize logical deduction as the starting point for moral knowledge. In essence, the empirical turn in moral philosophy, heralded by thinkers like Joshua Green, Jonathan Haidt, Daniel Kahneman, and Antonio Damasio, has profoundly enriched our understanding of the human moral enterprise. It has pulled back the curtain on the intricate dance between emotion and reason, shedding light on why the trolley problem often feels like such an intractable and deeply personal dilemma. It reminds us that our moral selves are not purely rational calculating machines, nor are they simply slaves to emotion. Instead, we are complex beings, equipped with an evolved brain that navigates the ethical landscape through a dynamic interplay of gut feelings and deliberate thought. This scientific exploration doesn't resolve the normative questions of the trolley problem, but it deepens them. It forces us to ask, if our moral judgments are often driven by emotional predispositions, should we trust these intuitions? Or should we strive to override them with more detached cognitive reasoning, even if that feels deeply unnatural? The brain on a train, it turns out, is a much more complicated and fascinating machine than we ever imagined, and its internal workings continue to pose profound challenges to our understanding of ourselves as moral agents. So far in our journey, we've navigated the intricate tracks of the trolley problem, exploring its many variations and the foundational ethical frameworks it illuminates. We've seen how it pits utilitarian desires to maximize overall good against deontological duties and rights. But now, it's time to move beyond the abstract hypothetical. It's time to ask, does this thought experiment born in the classrooms of philosophers have any real bearing on the messy, complex reality of human life? Does it offer genuine guidance, or is it merely an intellectual exercise, an ethical parlor trick? The answer, as with most things in philosophy, is complicated, but undeniably, the trolley problem has rolled directly from the lecture halls into the engineering labs, the hospital wards, and even the battlefields of our modern world. It has become a surprisingly potent lens through which to examine some of the most pressing ethical dilemmas of our time. Perhaps nowhere is this transition more striking than in the realm of autonomous vehicles and AI ethics. Think about it. A self-driving car, a technological marvel, is hurtling down a road. Suddenly, an unavoidable accident scenario emerges. The car's sensors detect a malfunction, perhaps its brakes fail, or a large object appears unexpectedly. The onboard AI has mere milliseconds to make a decision. Its programming, its ethics, will dictate the outcome. Imagine this: if the car continues straight, it will inevitably hit a group of 5 pedestrians crossing the road, perhaps ignoring a red light. If it swerves, it will undoubtedly crash into a barrier, gravely injuring or even killing its occupant, the driver. This is, without a doubt, a trolley problem in motion. The car is the trolley, and the lives are on the tracks. Should the autonomous vehicle prioritize the life of its occupant, who paid for the car and trusted it with their safety? Or should it prioritize minimizing harm to the greatest number, even if those are pedestrians who might share some blame for the situation? And if it prioritizes pedestrians, which ones? An elderly person, a child, a group of young adults? The problem quickly spirals into excruciating detail, forcing engineers to confront questions that philosophers have debated for centuries. These aren't just theoretical puzzles anymore, they are design challenges. Companies like Google, Tesla, and Mercedes-Benz, along with countless research institutions, are grappling with how to encode ethical algorithms into AI systems. They are essentially trying to operationalize a moral philosophy. Should a car be programmed with a utilitarian algorithm, always aiming for the greatest good for the greatest number? Or should it have a deontological constraint, perhaps never intentionally sacrificing an individual, regardless of the potential consequences? This became vividly apparent with the MIT Moral Machine experiment, launched by researchers at MIT Media Lab. This ambitious online platform, which gathered millions of responses from people across the globe, presented participants with a series of animated trolley-like dilemmas involving autonomous vehicles. You might be asked, should the car swerve to kill 3 jaywalking pedestrians but save its 2 passengers, or stay straight and kill its 2 passengers but save the 3 jaywalkers? What if the pedestrians were children? What if they were doctors? The experiment revealed fascinating and often conflicting cultural variations in moral intuitions. For example, some cultures showed a stronger preference for saving younger lives, while others prioritized obeying traffic laws. The implications of this rise of algorithmic ethics are profound. If an AI system makes a life-or-death decision, who bears moral responsibility? Is it the programmer, the manufacturer, the owner of the car, the AI itself? This blurring of lines challenges our traditional notions of agency and accountability. As the philosopher Wendell Wallach points out, we are moving from a world where machines assist humans in making ethical choices to one where machines are designed to make those choices themselves, often without human oversight in real time. This demands a robust and deeply considered philosophical framework, which the trolley problem, despite its limitations, helps to bring into sharp relief. It forces us to articulate our values before the crisis, rather than reacting haphazardly after it. Moving from the roads to the hospital wards, the trolley problem finds echoes in the weighty decisions made in medical ethics and triage. Historically, and even in contemporary times, medical professionals face dilemmas that bear an uncanny resemblance to our runaway trolley. Consider the stark reality of organ transplant allocation. While no one is actively pushing a patient in front of a bus, the underlying ethical tension is similar to the fat man variant of the trolley problem. Imagine a scenario, purely hypothetical for the sake of analogy, where a perfectly healthy patient walks into a hospital for a routine checkup, only to discover they are a perfect match for 5 other patients who are critically ill and will die without organ transplants. If the healthy patient were to be, let's say, harvested for their organs, 5 lives could be saved. This is the brutal logic of pure utilitarianism, echoing Judith Jarvis Thomson's infamous fat man dilemma. Of course, modern medical ethics, steeped in principles of autonomy and bodily integrity, overwhelmingly rejects such a notion. It underscores that while saving the most lives is a noble goal, it cannot come at the expense of violating the fundamental rights and personhood of an individual. This illustrates the enduring tension between the utilitarian impulse and deontological constraints that the trolley problem so deftly highlights. A more direct and horrifyingly real application arose during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hospitals globally faced unprecedented shortages of critical resources, most notably ventilators and ICU beds. When there were 10 patients needing a ventilator but only 5 available, doctors and ethics committees were forced into agonizing triage decisions. Who gets the life-saving machine and who doesn't? This wasn't a philosophical puzzle. It was a matter of life and death, with protocols rapidly being developed to guide these choices. These protocols often involved complex scoring systems designed to maximize the number of lives saved, or more precisely, the number of life years saved. Factors like age, pre-existing conditions, and likelihood of recovery were considered. Here we encounter the chilling distinction between statistical lives and identifiable lives. When we talk about public health policy, we often discuss saving statistical lives measures that might prevent an X number of deaths in a population over time. But in a triage situation, the lives are no longer statistical. They are concrete, identifiable individuals looking into the eyes of the medical staff, pleading for survival. This shift from abstract numbers to human faces intensifies the moral burden, demonstrating how the theoretical detachment of the trolley problem collapses in real-world crisis. The cold logic of maximizing outcomes clashes with the profound empathy and individual care inherent in the medical profession. Beyond the civilian sphere, the trolley problem's shadow extends into the grim realities of military ethics and warfare. Decisions made in combat are rarely clean-cut and often involve choosing between bad options, a core feature of trolley-like dilemmas. Consider the deployment of drone strikes. A military commander might receive intelligence about a high-value target in a densely populated area. A strike could neutralize that target, potentially saving numerous lives of soldiers or civilians in a broader conflict. However, the strike carries an inevitable risk of collateral damage, the deaths of innocent civilians nearby. This becomes a tragic utilitarian calculation. Is the strategic gain, the lives saved by eliminating the target, worth the foreseeable loss of innocent lives in the immediate vicinity? This isn't about pulling a lever to divert a train, it's about launching a missile, with consequences measured in human lives. Similarly, in ground warfare, command decisions often involve a harrowing version of the trolley problem. A commander might have to choose to send a small unit on a highly dangerous mission, knowing that many will likely die, but believing that their sacrifice will enable the main force to achieve an objective that saves a far greater number of lives or prevents a catastrophic defeat. Here, individual lives are weighed against collective survival, reflecting the utilitarian calculus that often underpins wartime strategy, while simultaneously confronting the deontological duty not to use soldiers as mere means to an end. The very concept of collateral damage implicitly acknowledges a trolley-like ethical framework, seeking to minimize harm while accepting some unavoidable loss in pursuit of a greater military objective. Just war theory itself, in its principles of proportionality and discrimination, attempts to provide a framework for navigating these trolley-like dilemmas, seeking to balance the good of waging war with the imperative to limit its devastation. So the trolley problem in its various guises clearly has contemporary relevance. It forces us to articulate, often explicitly, the values and priorities that guide our decisions, whether we are designing AI, allocating medical resources, or strategizing in conflict. It acts as a useful heuristic, revealing the foundational ethical disagreements that might otherwise remain implicit and unexamined in these new technological and societal contexts. However, despite its pervasive influence, the trolley problem itself has faced substantial fundamental critiques. Many philosophers and ethicists question its validity, its utility, and even its potential to mislead. These criticisms are vital, as they force us to consider the limitations of abstract thought experiments when confronted with the complex, nuanced reality of human moral decision-making. One of the most persistent criticisms is that the trolley problem is unrealistic and abstract. It is, after all, a highly contrived scenario, divorced from the messy reality of human life. Real-world ethical dilemmas rarely present themselves with such clean numbers, such clear-cut options, or such a complete absence of context. In life, we rarely stand on a bridge, watching a trolley approach, with full knowledge of exactly who is on which track and the precise outcome of our actions. Human decisions are deeply influenced by emotions, by personal relationships, by a history of interactions, by societal norms, and by a profound sense of uncertainty. The trolley problem strips all of this away. It asks us to be cold, calculating ethical machines, making choices based solely on abstract principles. But what about the agony of choosing, the trauma of taking a life, even indirectly? What about the personal responsibility one feels, regardless of the optimal outcome? Critics argue that by removing these crucial human elements, the trolley problem distorts our understanding of morality rather than clarifying it. It tells us little about how actual people behave in morally fraught situations, or how they should behave when overwhelmed by fear, love, or despair. This leads to a related critique, which some have termed ethical fetishism. Does our overfocus on these extreme, improbable scenarios distract us from more common, yet equally pressing and often more solvable ethical issues? While autonomous vehicles present fascinating future challenges, how much intellectual and emotional energy do we expend on trolley problems for self-driving cars, compared to, say, addressing systemic injustices, climate change, or widespread poverty? These are issues that impact millions, are happening now, and demand practical, incremental ethical solutions rather than grand, one-off sacrificial choices. Critics worry that by endlessly debating how many hypothetical lives to save in impossible scenarios, we become desensitized and divert attention from the tangible, messy ethical work of improving the real world. Another powerful critique comes from the field of social psychology, particularly through the lens of situationism. Thinkers like John Doris argue that human behavior is far more influenced by situational factors, the specific context, the immediate environment, even seemingly trivial details, than by stable character traits or abstract ethical principles. The trolley problem assumes that individuals will apply a consistent moral framework, utilitarian, deontological, etc., across different versions of the dilemma. However, empirical studies in psychology have shown that minor alterations in framing or presentation can significantly change people's moral judgments, sometimes in ways that contradict their stated principles. For instance, the physical act of pushing someone, fat man, versus pulling a lever, standard trolley, elicits a different emotional and neurological response, even if the logical outcome is the same. This isn't just about emotional squeamishness. It suggests that our moral reasoning is deeply intertwined with our gut feelings and the immediate reality of an action, rather than being purely abstract. If our moral behavior is largely situation-dependent, then abstract ethical principles derived from highly simplified scenarios might be far less predictive or prescriptive than we assume. Furthermore, there's a critique regarding biased framing. Does the way the trolley problem is presented inherently steer our intuitions? The scenarios are often framed with clean numbers, 1 versus 5, no prior relationships between the characters, and an artificial sense of certainty about the outcomes. This clean, almost game-like presentation might inadvertently push us towards a more utilitarian calculus. If the problem were instead framed with more ambiguity, with personal connections, e.g., the person on the track is your brother, or with unknown probabilities of success, our intuitions might shift dramatically. This suggests that the trolley problem might not be revealing fundamental moral truths, but rather testing how we respond to a very specific, artificially constrained kind of ethical puzzle. Finally, some critics express concern about moral exhaustion or desensitization. Does repeated exposure to such extreme, hypothetical dilemmas, especially in a detached, academic setting, lead to a desensitization to their gravity? If we constantly discuss sacrificing individuals for the greater good, even in a hypothetical context, might it subtly erode our natural revulsion to such acts? Does it train us to think of human lives as interchangeable units in a cold equation, rather than as intrinsically valuable and unique? This isn't to say that ethical debate is harmful, but rather to caution against the potential psychological toll and the risk of trivializing the profound horror of these choices when they are constantly recycled as intellectual exercises. So where does this leave us? On one hand, the trolley problem offers a powerful analytical tool. It forces explicit discussion of values, revealing the underlying ethical commitments that we hold, often implicitly. It helps us map out the contours of moral disagreement, particularly when facing new technologies and unprecedented challenges. For instance, without the trolley problem, it would be much harder to articulate the competing values at play when programming autonomous vehicles. It provides a shared language, a common ground, however artificial, for confronting difficult choices. As philosopher Philippa Foot, one of the modern pioneers of the trolley problem, showed, it can illuminate our moral intuitions and help us distinguish between permissible and impermissible actions based on the structure of the harm caused. On the other hand, the arguments against its direct application are compelling. Real-world choices are almost never made under conditions of perfect certainty or complete information. There are always unknowns, always prior obligations, always emotional complexities. The moral machine results, showing significant cultural variability in responses, clearly challenge the idea that there is a single, universally correct answer to these dilemmas, or that our intuition should simply be aggregated to form ethical policy. This variability suggests that moral principles are not universally pre-programmed into us, but are often shaped by culture, context, and individual experience. As Kwame Anthony Appiah, a philosopher known for his work on ethics and identity, has shown, moral values are often deeply embedded in cultural practices and narratives, not just abstract reasoning. Consider historical anecdotes that illuminate this tension. The development of bioethics as a distinct field in the latter half of the 20th century was a direct response to medical advancements that created novel trolley-like dilemmas. Organ transplantation, life support technologies, genetic engineering, these technologies forced physicians, policymakers, and philosophers to move beyond traditional medical paternalism and grapple with questions of patient autonomy, informed consent, and the allocation of scarce resources. They couldn't just say the doctor knows best. They had to explicitly articulate ethical principles to guide these new powers. This was a shift towards applied ethics, moving philosophical inquiry out of the ivory tower and into the operating room. Similarly, early discussions around ethical principles in engineering and technology, which began in earnest after the destructive capabilities of the atomic bomb became clear, also wrestled with trolley-like questions of responsibility for consequences, even unintended ones. Engineers had to consider not just can we build it, but should we build it, and what are the moral implications if we do? The trolley problem in its simple elegance has become a shorthand for this complex ethical reckoning. Let's revisit the powerful example of Sophie's choice, not as a direct trolley problem, but as a different kind of moral dilemma that highlights the trolley problem's limitations. In William Styron's novel, Sophie is forced by a Nazi doctor to choose which of her two children will live and which will die. She is forced to choose, and the choice itself is a moral atrocity, a violation of her very being. This isn't about minimizing harm, it's about a situation designed to utterly break the individual, to desecrate their moral agency. The trolley problem, with its detached viewpoint, fails to capture the profound psychological and moral devastation of such an imposed choice. It reminds us that some dilemmas are not meant to be solved in a utilitarian sense, but rather to be recognized as inherently tragic. Ultimately, the trolley problem, for all its abstractness and the valid criticisms leveled against it, serves a crucial purpose. It forces us to articulate our moral principles. It demands that we confront the deep, often uncomfortable tension between various ethical frameworks. Do we prioritize outcomes like the utilitarians? Or do we prioritize duties and rights like the deontologists? Do we consider the virtues of the moral agent as virtue ethicists would? In the complex landscape of the 21st century, with rapidly advancing technologies and global challenges, these questions are no longer confined to academic debates. They are the questions being asked by engineers in Silicon Valley, by doctors in emergency rooms, and by policymakers making decisions that affect millions. The trolley problem, therefore, is not a perfect guide to moral action, nor does it offer easy answers. It is instead a mirror. It reflects our deepest moral intuitions, our inconsistencies, our biases, and the fundamental philosophical disagreements that continue to shape human society. It reminds us that beneath the surface of seemingly simple choices lie profound ethical complexities, and that navigating the future will require not just technological ingenuity, but also a profound and ongoing philosophical engagement with what it means to be human, and what it means to live ethically in an increasingly complex world. The tracks of the trolley problem continue to run, not just through hypothetical landscapes, but through the very fabric of our emerging reality. And we, the passengers and the conductors, must continue to grapple with where they led.